Welcome to part 2. You've returned to boring history to sleep, where the past whispers and time forgets to hurry. Tonight, we wander through muddy streets, past silent monasteries, and into the quiet rhythm of medieval life. There are no dragons here, only damp cloaks, wooden bowls, and prayers before dawn. As the world outside rushes, we'll move slowly through feudal fields and candlelit chapels. So, exhale, let your thoughts dissolve like parchment in the rain, and let the gentle pace of history carry you to rest. This is not a story of kings or crusades, but of everyday souls surviving under stone and sky. Tonight's chapter is Life in the Middle Ages. Power, faith, and survival. Sleep well, traveller of time. An institution is not necessarily discredited when we discover that it has grown from small beginnings, has been applied under new conditions to new purposes, and in the course of a long history has been defended by arguments which are demonstrably false. The child, no doubt, is father of the man, but the man is something different from, and may well be something better than, his infant self. We must not attach undue importance to the study of origins. On the other hand, we cannot afford to neglect them. However slight the fibres by which the present is rooted in the past, to observe them is to realize the continuity of human development, the most important, the most obvious, and the most neglected of the lessons that history can teach. It is true that the roots, however strong and however deeply set, are insufficient to account for the characteristics of the plant which springs from them. But it is also true that neither plants nor institutions can altogether shed the husk of their immaturity. They are not entirely adapted to the conditions under which they reach their full development. The papacy in the zenith of its power and renown is partly new and partly old. When we consider the papal theory as it floated before the mind of a Gregory VII or an Innocent III, it produces in us the same impression of symmetry, logical consistency, and completeness, which we experience on entering for the first time one of the great medieval churches. But when once we have grasped the design of the architect, we shall usually find that he has conformed in some respects to unmeaning traditions inherited from an earlier period, and further, that his work incorporates the remnants of an older, simpler structure. Here are pillars of massive girth, altogether disproportionate to the delicate arches which they carry. There an old tower has been buttressed to make it capable of supporting a new spire. For all the builder's cunning, we can yet distinguish between the new and the renovated. So it is with the papal apologia in the great days of papal policy. A sentence from the laws of ancient Rome dovetails with an axiom stolen from the philosophers of the Porch or the Academy. Fables of Gallic or Egyptian origin are invoked to corroborate the canons of Nicene and Chalcedonian synods. A text from a Hebrew prophet is interpreted by the fancy of an African expositor. The fabric composed of these incongruous elements has in truth a unity of purpose, but the design is so disguised and so perverted by the recalcitrance of the materials that we are irresistibly impelled to ask how and why they came to be employed. More than any other human institution, the papacy has suffered from a supposed necessity of justifying every forward step by precedent and reference to authority. Twice in the course of 16 centuries, the Holy See has ventured on a startling change of front and has been sorely embarrassed to rebut the charge of inconsistency. One such change was silently effected at the close of the 17th century, when the popes ceased to concern themselves more than was unavoidable with international affairs. This was a great change, yet not so great as that made in the latter part of the 11th century by Gregory VII, for he revolutionized the whole theory of papal prerogative. Neither a profound lawyer nor a profound theologian, he regarded the past history of his office with the idealism of a poet, and looked into its future with the sanguine radicalism of a Machiavelli or a Hobbes. Gregory VII conceived of Christendom as an undivided state, of a state as a polity dominated by a sovereign, of a sovereign as a ruler who must be either absolute or useless, and who, he asked, but the heir of the Prince of the Apostles, could presume to claim a power so tremendous? For us, The audacity of his pretensions is excused by the lofty aims which they were meant to serve. To conciliate contemporary opinion, it was necessary that the new claims should be represented as the revival of old rites, as the logical corollaries of undisputed truths, and this course involved as its consequence an industrious, if partially unconscious, perversion of past history. For the popes who had gone before him claimed powers which, though extensive, were capable of definition, which, though startling, could in the main be defended by appeal to well-established usage. The new policy led to this paradoxical situation that precedents were diligently invoked to prove the Pope superior to all precedents. With Gregory VII, the primacy of Western Christendom assumed a new character, but the primacy, in one form or another, had for centuries belonged to the Roman See. So much his remote predecessors had achieved, and their success is all the more remarkable when we remember how few of them had been distinguished statesmen. It is no matter for surprise that, in the course of 9 troubled centuries, some bishops of Bourne had proved incompetent, and others had betrayed the interests committed to their charge. It is, however, surprising that the Roman See was able to assume and hold the leading position among Western bishops, without rendering much service to the extension or the organization of the Church. Of all the early popes, save Leo I and Gregory, it is true that we may be tolerably at home in the history of their times without knowing much about them. No pope is ranked among the leading Western fathers. The only considerable theologian who occupied the Holy See before the year 1000 is Gregory III, and the highest praise which we can give his writings is that they imparted new life to some ideas of St. Augustine. It is as statesmen, not as thinkers, that the early popes appeal to our attention, yet their practical achievements scarcely account for the reverence which they inspired. The one great mission which Rome set on foot was that of Augustine to England. The other evangelists of the Dark Ages found their inspiration elsewhere, in the monasteries of Ireland or of Gaul and Germany. If we consider the progress of theological science and of ecclesiastical organization, we find that the great controversies were resolved, and the great legislative assemblies convened in the Eastern Empire. It was but rarely that Rome asserted her right to speak in the name even of the Western Church. The record of the early popes who attained to such a momentary preeminence was not such as the West could recollect with satisfaction. In fact, it was due to other causes than the merits of individual popes that Rome became and remained the religious metropolis of Europe. How, then, are we to account for her triumphant progress? Hobbes suggested one explanation when he called the papacy the ghost of the Roman Empire. And it is true that the later emperors found it convenient to confer special privileges on the bishops of their ancient capital. But they adopted this policy too late, when reverence for the empire was already declining in the West. By imperial grants, the papacy gained no substantial powers, while individual popes lost credit and independence by their special connection with the new Rome on the Bosporus. They were compelled to play an ignominious part in the squabbles of the Eastern churches. They were loaded with onerous secular duties. They became the emblems and the agents of an alien tyranny, mistrusted alike by the barbarian invaders and the nominal subjects of the empire. Other critics have explained the prestige of the papacy as the fruit of successful impostures. For this hypothesis there is little to be said. 1 or 2 popes, not the greatest, have condescended to use forged title deeds. But the effect of these frauds has been much exaggerated. The most famous of them are the donation of Constantine and the false decretals. The former, though probably of Roman origin, was little used at Rome and only served to justify the modest beginnings of the temporal power. The latter are of more importance and are sometimes regarded as opening an era of new pretensions. In fact, they are little more than reiterations and amplifications of very ancient claims. Though frequently quoted by the canon lawyers, they are not indispensable links in the claim of historical proofs and precedents. They are chiefly significant as attesting the general desire of churchmen to find some warrant for a vigorous exercise of the papal prerogative. A primate with real powers was desired, not only by the clergy of the national churches as a bulwark against the brutal oppression of the state, but also by all religious thinkers as a symbol of corporate unity and a guarantee of doctrinal uniformity. No, theory can be regarded as supplying a satisfactory explanation of papal authority, unless it explains this general belief in the necessity for a visible head of the Western Church. In part, the necessity was political. Exposed to the common danger of secular tyranny, the national churches looked for safety in federation, and they notified their union in the only way that uneducated laymen could understand, by announcing their subjection to a single spiritual sovereign. But there remained the problem of justifying this act of independence amounting to rebellion. The justification was found in two arguments, the one historical, the other doctrinal, the one based upon the Roman legend of St. Peter, the other on the acknowledged importance of holding fast to right tradition. Each of these arguments calls for some consideration. St. Peter, says the legend, was invested with the primacy among the apostles. Such is the plain meaning of the Saviour's declaration, tu es Petrus. St. Peter founded the Roman Church and instituted the Roman bishopric. To Linus, the first bishop, Peter bequeathed his divine commission and his knowledge of the Christian verities. From Linus, these gifts descended without diminution to one after another in the unbroken chain of his successors. Hence, Rome is entitled to the same preeminence among the churches which Peter held among his brethren. To examine the historical basis of the legend would be a lengthy and unprofitable task. Of St. Peter's connection with the eternal city we know nothing certain, except that he preached and suffered there. If bishops existed in his time, there is some reason for thinking that the office was collegiate, and that the committee of bishops was less important then in the spiritual life of the community than at a later time. Not until the 2nd century did the episcopate become monarchical, and the holder of the office the supreme authority within the church by which he was elected. The change was complete by the time of Irenaeus, who wrote circa 180 AD. To him, we owe our earliest catalogue of Roman bishops, beginning with Linus and ending with Eleutherus, the 12th from Peter and the contemporary of Irenaeus. The later names in the list are doubtless those of authentic bishops. The earlier may be in some sense historical, the names of famous presbyters or of men who made their mark on the old episcopal committee. A point of secondary interest is that Irenaeus speaks of bishops, not of popes. This title came into use 100 years after his time. More important is the fact that, in the 3rd century, when our documents become more copious, Rome is generally recognized as first in dignity among the churches, ecclesia principalis, but has no appellate jurisdiction and no legislative powers. It is only admitted that, when disputes arise on points of tradition, her testimony is entitled to special honor, as that of a church which preserves the memory of Peter's teaching. As doctrinal controversies become more acute and more fundamental, the importance of tradition is emphasized. The authority of those who voice it is magnified. Ultimately, all the pretensions of the Holy See are founded on the claim that she possesses the only undefiled tradition. But it was not until long after the 3rd century that the consequences of the claim were realized even by the claimants. If we were invited at the present day to suggest a means of conserving intact a body of doctrinal definitions and disciplinary law, we should not naturally select some mode of oral transmission as the safest available. Yet this expedient has found much favor in the past, even among the Jews, with their extreme respect for sacred books. The written word was made of none account by the traditions of expositors. The votaries of the Greek mystic cults deliberately avoided writing down their more important formulae. Several considerations were in favor of this curious policy. There were no scientific canons for the interpretation of written texts. Allegorizing commentators read their own wild fancies into the plainest sentences. The only way of meeting them was to fall back on the traditional interpretation. We use the texts to test the traditions, but criticism in its early stages pursues the opposite course, and as a natural consequence rates tradition above scripture. Other reasons which discouraged the use of writing were, first, the fear that no literary skill might be equal to the difficulty of accurate statement. Secondly, the natural reluctance of the religious mind to let the deepest truths be exposed to the vulgar scoffs and criticism of the uninitiated. Thirdly, some remnant of the primitive superstition that the formulae of a ritual are magic spells, which would lose their potency if published to the world. And finally, the natural instinct of a sacerdotal class to reserve the knowledge of deepest mysteries to a select inner circle. For all these reasons, a jealously guarded tradition, commonly designated as the Arcana or Secreta, was to be found in all the early Christian churches. To give a few examples, the Apostles' Creed, the distinctive symbol of the Roman Church, was preserved by oral tradition only down to the 4th century, and was not imparted to any catechumen until the time of his baptism. The minute rules of penitential discipline were first committed to writing by Theodore of Tarsus, Archbishop of Canterbury, towards the close of the 7th century, and this innovation was sharply criticized by some ecclesiastical synods. Most remarkable of all is the reluctance of the churches to write down the essential, operative parts of the Mass. Written copies are first mentioned in the 4th century, and it was not until a much later period that the diversities of local tradition were corrected by the issue of a standard text. It might be supposed that the non-existence of official copies was due to the want of any device, such as printing, by which they could be cheaply multiplied. But there is a curious fact which suggests that publication was considered undesirable. One section of the canon of the Mass was called the secret part, secretum, and was recited by the celebrant in an undertone that it might not become known to the congregation. Similarly, all literary exposition of such central doctrines as the Atonement or the Trinity was deprecated by early theologians, who pass by them with the remark that they are known to the initiate. This cult of secrecy engendered difficulties which are written large upon the page of history. Disputes arose about the wording of the creeds, about the canon of the scriptures, about the number and nature of the mortal sins, and the penances which they should entail. Periodically, a curious investigator raised a storm by claiming that he had discovered a flaw in the traditional formulae, or a mistake in the sense which was currently attached to them. The one way of meeting such doubts was to compare the traditions of the older churches. This could be done by a provincial synod or a general council. But of these tribunals, the former was unsatisfactory, as its decisions were of merely local validity and might be overruled by the voice of the universal church. The general council was hard to convene, particularly after a rift had opened between the Eastern and the Western churches. It was easier to select as the final arbiter a bishop, whose knowledge of tradition was derived from an apostolic predecessor. In the East, there were 3 such sees: Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria. But in the West, Rome alone satisfied the necessary conditions, and the bishops of Rome could claim, with some show of reason, that their tradition was derived from a worthier source and had been better guarded against contagion than that of any other apostolic church. Was it not a well-established fact that Rome had preserved an unwavering front in the face of the heretical Arius, when even Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria had wavered? Recourse to Rome as the oracle of the faith was so obvious an expedient, given the prevailing attitude towards tradition, that we can only be surprised to find how slow and gradual was the triumph of the Roman claims. The victory of logic was retarded both by the pride and by the common sense of the other Western churches. On the one hand, the See of Carthage clung to the old ideal of Christendom as a confederation of self-governing churches, which might consult one another as they pleased, but recognized no superior except a general council. Carthage carried with her the whole Church of Africa and furnished an example which less illustrious communities were proud to imitate. The conquest of Africa by the Vandal heretics was necessary before the African Christians would consent to look to Rome as their spiritual metropolis. On the other hand, the rulings of the Roman bishops were justly suspected of being tempered by regard for expediency. Sometimes they relaxed penitential discipline for fear of driving the weaker brethren to apostasy. Sometimes, under pressure from Constantinople, they proposed an ambiguous compromise with heresy. Such considerations were but gradually overborne by the pressure of circumstances. The spread of Arianism and the eruption of the Teutons, themselves often Arians, at length compelled the churches to take the obvious means of preserving their imperiled uniformity and union. It is in the Acts of the Council of Sardica 343 AD, that we find the first explicit recognition of the Pope as an arbiter and, we may almost say, a judge of appeal. This council was merely a gathering of Western bishops, and the canons which it passed were never accepted by the Church of Africa. So doubtful was their validity that the popes of the next generation disingenuously asserted that they had been passed at the earlier and more famous Council of Nicaea, 325. Yet even at Sardica, the Pope was only endowed with one definite prerogative. Henceforward, any bishop condemned by a provincial synod might appeal to him. He could then order a second trial to be held, and could send his legates to sit among the judges. But he could not hear the case in his own court. More striking than this decree are the words of the letter which the council addressed to Pope Julius. It will be very right and fitting for the priests of the Lord from every province to refer to their head, that is, to the See of Peter. This recommendation was readily obeyed by the churches of Gaul and Spain. Questions from their bishops poured in upon the popes, who began to give their decisions in the form of open letters and to claim for these letters the binding force of law. Pope Liberius, 352–366 AD, appears to have commenced the practice, although the earliest of the extant decretals is from the pen of Pope Siricius, 385. 60 years after Siricius' time, when the Western Empire was in its death agony, this claim to legislative power was formally confirmed by the Emperor Valentinian III, 445. But for some time after the Council of Sardica, the new prerogative was used with the greatest caution. The popes of that period use every precaution to make their oracular answers inoffensive. They assure their correspondents that Rome enjoins no novelties, that she does not presume to decide any point on which tradition is silent, that she is merely executing a mandate which general councils have laid upon her. Those who evince respect for her claims are overwhelmed with compliments. A decretal of Innocent 402–417 begins as follows. Very dear brother, the Church's rules of life and conduct are well known to a priest of your merit and dignity. But since you have urgently inquired of us concerning the rule which the Roman Church prescribes, we bow to your desire and herewith send you our rules of discipline, arranged in order. On the other hand, no opportunity is lost of calling attention to the Roman primacy. Pope Siricius, 384–398, writes in one of his letters, "We bear the burdens of all who are oppressed. It is the Apostle Peter who speaks in our person." Through the more confidential and domestic utterances of these popes, there runs a vein of haughty self-assertion. In the homilies of Leo III, 440–461, the text Tuus Petrus rings like a trumpet note. Here we have the Roman ruler communing with his Roman people, the pride of empire taking a new shape amidst the ruins of that secular empire which the pagan Romans of the past had built up. In the general chaos produced by the barbarian migrations, the consequence of the papacy, as compared with that of other Western sees, was considerably enhanced by various causes. By the ruin of Carthage, the most unsparing of her critics, by the progressive deterioration of the other churches, which was most marked in those provinces where the barbarians were most readily converted, by the rising tide of ignorance, which overwhelmed all rival conceptions of Christendom and blotted out the past history of the Church. So great was this ignorance that Innocent I could claim, without much fear of contradiction, that no man has founded any church in Italy, Sicily, Gaul, Spain, or Africa, excepting those whom Peter and his successors have ordained as priests. In the Italian peninsula, there were 3 churches, Ravenna, Milan, Aquileia, which obstinately refused to consider themselves mere offshoots from the See of Peter. But the legend struck root and throve, as successive popes associated themselves with missions to the unconverted tribes and with reforms in the barbarian churches. Among the earlier events which contributed to make the Roman belief the standard for all Western Christendom, we need only mention the conquests of the Orthodox, Frankish monarchy, the official conversions from Arianism of the Burgundians, 516, and the Visigoths in Spain, 586. the extirpation of the Vandals and Ostrogoths by Justinian's generals, the missions of Augustine to England, of Wilfrid, Willibrord and Boniface, to the Germans, the submission of the Frankish Church under the influence of Boniface and Pepin the Short, 748. Naturally, the moral influence of Rome in the northern lands was augmented by the revival of the Western Empire, which meant the cooperation of Pope and Emperor in the extension of the Christian Republic. Cyril and Methodius, the apostles of the Slavs, found it necessary to renounce the allegiance of the Greek Church and to place their converts under the protection of Rome, 866. It was from Rome that Saint Adalbert went forth on his ill-starred but glorious mission to the Prussians, 997. And it was a pope, Sylvester II, who earned the glory of uniting the Hungarian people to Western Christendom, 1000. Finally, Canute, the Great, of Denmark and of England, came in the manner of a pilgrim, 1027, to lay the homage of his Scandinavian subjects on the altar of St. Peter. The popes reaped where they had not sown, but the harvest was rich and splendid. No less important was the political character which the papal office assumed with the revival of the empire. Already under Gregory the Great, we can trace the beginnings of a temporal power. Naturally and necessarily the Pope, already like other bishops a functionary charged with important secular duties, took upon himself the protection and government of Rome and the surrounding duchy, when the rulers of Byzantium shook off these unprofitable responsibilities. Naturally and excusably he claimed, over his vast Italian estates, the powers of jurisdiction which every landowner was assuming as a measure of self-defense against oppression or unbridled anarchy. In the time of Pepin the Short, a further step was taken. The Frank, unwilling to involve himself in Italy, yet anxious to secure the Holy See against the Lombards, recognized Pope Stephen II as the lawful heir of the derelict imperial possessions, and Charles the Great, both as king and as emperor, confirmed the donation of his father. To make the Pope an independent sovereign was indeed a policy which he refused to entertain. His ideal was that of the Eastern emperors, himself as the head of state and church, the Pope as the patriarch of all the churches in the empire, elected with the emperor's approval, ruling the clergy with the emperor's counsel, enjoying over the lands of his the largest privileges bestowed on any bishop, but still in all secular affairs a subject of the empire. But on the other hand, arose at Rome a different conception of the Pope's prerogative. Long ago, Pope Gelasius had formulated the principle, more useful to his remote successors than himself, of the two powers, church and state, both derived from God and both entitled to absolute power in their respective spheres. On this principle, the state should not interfere with episcopal elections or with matters of faith and discipline. It should not exercise jurisdiction over the priesthood, who are servants of the church, or over church estates, since they are held in trust for God and the poor. This view was proclaimed to the world by Leo III, who caused to be set up in the Lateran a mosaic representing in an allegory his relations to the empire. St. Peter sits enthroned above. Charles and Leo kneel to right and left in the act of receiving from the apostle the pallium and the gonfalon, the symbols of their respective offices. No powerful emperor ever accepted the Gelasian principle entire. To refute it was, however, difficult, so well did it harmonize with the current conception of the state. Under the later Carolingians, it became the program both of reformers and of mere ecclesiastical politicians. The new monasteries, founded or reorganized under the influence of Cluny, placed themselves beneath the special protection of the Pope, thus escaping from secular burdens. The national hierarchies hailed the forgeries of the pseudo-Isidore as the charter of ecclesiastical liberty. Pope Nicholas I took his stand at the head of the new movement and gave it a remarkable development when he asserted his jurisdiction over the adulterous Lothair II. 863. Nicholas died before he could give further illustrations of his claim to be supreme, even over kings, in matters of morality and faith. From his time to that of Hildebrand, there was no pope vigorous enough to make a similar example. Dragged down by their temporal possessions to the level of municipal seigneurs and party instruments, The popes from 867 to 962 were, at the best, no more than vigorous Italian princes. To that level they returned after the period of the Saxon Ottos, 962–1002. In those 40 years there were glimpses of a better future. The German Pope, Gregory V, allied himself to Cluny, 996–999. As Sylvester II, 9999–1003, the versatile Gerbert of Aurillac, at once mathematician, rhetorician, philosopher and statesman, entered into the romantic dreams of his friend and pupil, Otto III, and formed others on his own behalf, which centered round the papacy rather than the empire. Sylvester saw in imagination the Holy See at the head of a federation of Christian monarchies. But fate was no kinder to him than to Otto. He outlived his boy patron only by a year. Modern life has travelled so far beyond medieval Christianity that it is only with an effort we retrace our steps to the intellectual position of a Saint Bernard, a Saint Francis, or the Imitatio Christi. Apart from the difficulties of an unfamiliar terminology, we have become estranged from ideas which then were commonplaces. Beliefs once held to be self-evident and cardinal now hover on the outer verge of speculative thought, as bare possibilities, as unproved and unprovable guesses at truth. Our own creeds, it may be, rest upon no sounder bottom of logical demonstration, but they have been framed to answer doubts and to account for facts, which medieval theories ignored, and in framing them, we have been constrained partly to revise, partly to destroy, the medieval conceptions of God and the universe, of man and the moral law. This is not the place for a critique of medieval religion, but unless we bear in mind some essential features of the Catholic system of thought, we miss the key to that ecclesiastical statesmanship which dominates the 12th and 13th centuries. The programme of the great popes, from Gregory VII to Boniface VIII, must appear a tissue of absurdities, of preposterous ambitions and indefensible actions, unless it is studied in relation to a theology as far remote from primitive Christianity as from the cults and philosophies of classical antiquity. The first article in this theology is the existence of a personal God who, though all-pervading and all-powerful, does not reveal himself immediately to the human beings whom he has created to be his worshippers, and does not so order the world that events shall always express his will and purpose. He has endowed man with a sinful nature and has permitted his universe to be invaded by evil intelligences of superhuman power and malignancy, who tempt man to destruction and are bent upon subverting the divine order of which they form a part. He is supremely benevolent, and yet he only manifests the full measure of this quality when his help is invoked by prayer. His goodwill often finds expression in miracles, that is, in the suspending or reversing of the general laws which he has himself laid down for the regulation of the universe and human destinies. He is inscrutable and incomprehensible, yet to be deceived as to the nature of his being is the greatest of all sins against his majesty. The goal of the religious life is personal communion with him, the intuitive apprehension and spontaneous acceptance of his will, the beatific vision of his excellencies. But this state of blessedness cannot be reached by mere self-discipline. The prayers, the meditations, the good works of the isolated and uninstructed individual can only serve to condone a state of irremediable ignorance. The avenue to knowledge of him lies through faith, and faith means the unquestioning acceptance of the twofold revelation of himself, which he has given in the Scriptures and in the tradition of the Church. The two revelations are in effect reduced to one by the statement that only the Church is competent to give an authoritative exposition of the sacred writings. Upon the Church hangs the welfare of the individual and the world. Without participation in her sacraments, the individual would be eternally cut off from God. Without her prayers, the tide of evil forces would no longer be held in check by recurring acts of miraculous intervention, but would rise irresistibly and submerge the human race. A society charged with these tremendous duties, the only organ of the divine will and affording the only assurance of salvation, must obviously be superior to all mundane powers. It would be monstrous if her teaching were modified. if her powers of self-government were restricted to suit the ambitions or the so-called common sense of a lay ruler. The Church stands to the state in the relation of the head to the members, of the soul to the body, of the sun to the moon. The state exists to provide the material foundations of the Christian society, to protect the Church, to extend her sphere, and to constrain those who rebel against her law. In a sense, the state is ordained by God, but only in the sense of being a necessary condition for the existence of a Christian commonwealth. Logically, the state should be the servant of the Church, acting with delegated powers under her direction. But theories, however logical, must come to terms with facts or vanish into the limbo of chimeras. The power of the Hildebrandine Church was subject to serious limitations. On certain questions of importance, the national hierarchies were inclined to side with the state against the Pope, and thus, for example, the claims of the Curia to tax the clergy and to override the rights of ecclesiastical patrons were restricted at one time or another by concordats or by secular legislation, such as the English Statutes of Provisors and Praemunire, where the whole of the clerical order presented a solid front. It was sometimes possible to make good a claim against which there was much to be said on grounds of common sense, as, for instance, benefit of clergy, the exclusive jurisdiction of the Church over criminous ecclesiastics, which was enforced even against a sovereign so powerful and so astute as Henry II of England. But, in the last resort, the pretensions of the Church depended for success upon a public opinion which was hard to move, not because the average layman was critical or anti-clerical, but because he was illogical and unimaginative. He remained cold to any program of reform which could only be justified by long trains of deductive reasoning. His natural impulse was against violent innovations, and he felt rather than argued that the state, as the ultimate guarantee of social order, must be maintained even at some cost of theological consistency. Until he could be convinced that high moral issues and his own salvation were at stake, it was useless or dangerous to excommunicate his king and to lay his country under interdict. For want of lay support, the Church failed to make good such important claims as those of immunity from national taxation and of jurisdiction in cases of commercial contract. More striking still, she was prevented from establishing the Inquisition in states where that tribunal would have found no lack of work. Still, in spite of clerical divisions and lay conservatism, the freedom of the Church was an ideal which commanded universal homage. And it was necessary for the most obstinate opponent of ecclesiastical privilege to make it clear that his policy involved no real attack upon this freedom. Otherwise, defeat was certain. Thrice in 200 years, the cry for freedom was raised against the Holy Roman Empire, and 3 prolonged conflicts ended in the discomfiture of the most resolute and resourceful statesman who ever held that office. Henry IV, 1056–1105, Henry V, 1106–1125, Frederick Barbarossa, 1152–1190, and Frederick II, 1212–1250. In the first of these great conflicts, the question at issue was the reformation of the national clergy and their emancipation from secular authority. Henry IV paid for his assertion of prerogative and custom, both by the ignominious though illusory surrender at Canossa, 1077, and by the unparalleled humiliations of his latter days, when he was compelled, as the prisoner of his own son, not only to abdicate but also to sign a confession of infamous offences against religion and morality. Henry V, reviving the plans of the father whom he had betrayed and entrapped, was reduced through very weariness to conclude the Concordat of Worms, 1122. A renunciation which only ended in something less than absolute defeat for the empire, because the imperial concessions were interpreted with more regard to the letter than the spirit. In the second struggle, the immediate issue was the freedom of papal elections, the ultimate question whether pope or emperor should shape the Church's policy, and Frederick Barbarossa was compelled, after a schism of 17 years' duration, to surrender claims which dated from the time of Charles the Great, and to make peace with Alexander III, whom he had sworn that he would never recognize, Treaty of Anagni, 1176. Henry VI, the son of Barbarossa, when he joined the Kingdom of Sicily to the empire through his marriage with Constance, the heiress of the Norman throne, sowed the seed of a new conflict, and bequeathed to Frederick II the perilous ideal of an Italy united under a Hohenstaufen despotism. Ecclesiastical freedom now became a euphemism for the preservation of the temporal power and for the project of a federal Italy, owning allegiance to a papal suzerain. Frederick II, who came nearer to success in a more far-reaching policy than any of his predecessors, was worn out by the steady alternation of successes with reverses, and left his sons and grandson to reap the bitter harvest of a failure which he had barely realized. The moral issue dwindles to smaller proportions in each successive stage of this titanic duel between the titular representatives of state and church. And from first to last, the papacy depended largely upon allies who were pursuing their own objects in the church's name. The German princes, the Normans of Lower Italy and Sicily, the Lombard communes, all contributed in varying degrees to the defeat of the Henrys and the Fredericks. The German princes brought Henry IV to his knees at two critical moments in the reign. The majority of them held obstinately aloof from the Italian wars of Barbarossa, and Frederick II, who endeavoured to buy their neutrality by extravagant concessions, found himself confronted by German rebels and pretenders towards the close of his career, 1246–1250, when the Italian situation appeared to be changing in his favour. The Normans intervened more than once in the wars of investitures to shelter a fugitive pope or rescue Rome from German armies. The Lombards, as we shall relate elsewhere, were the chief barrier between Rome and Frederick Barbarossa, between Frederick II and Germany. Charles of Anjou was the latest and most efficient champion of the papal cause, and he lives in history as the forerunner of the conscienceless and shameless statesmanship of the Renaissance epoch. And yet, when we have allowed for the utility of these alliances, the question remains why radical communes, rebellious feudatories, and adventurers in search of kingdoms found it worth their while to enlist in the service of the Church and to endure the restrictions which such a service inevitably entailed. The true strength of the Church lay in her moral influence. It was a handful, even among the clergy, who devoted themselves heart and soul to the ideal of society which she set up. Still, her ideal was in possession of the field. It might be subjected to a negative and skeptical criticism by an isolated philosopher, by a heretical sect, or by an orthodox layman smarting under priestly arrogance. But when the forces of the Church were mobilized, the indifferent majority stood aside and shrugged their shoulders. The way of Rome might not be the way of Christ. But if the apostolic misinterpreted the lessons of Scripture and tradition, from whom could a better rule of life be learned? An erring church was better than no church at all. In the 13th century, when papal extortions were a subject of complaint in every European state, Frederick II put himself forward as the champion of the common interest and appealed from the Pope to the bar of public opinion. It was his turn today, he said with perfect truth. The turn of kings and princes would come when the emperor was overthrown. His eloquence made some impression, but his fellow sovereigns could not or would not prevent the Pope from taxing their clergy and recruiting their subjects for the holy war against the secular chief of Christendom, the head and front of whose offending was that he opposed the interests of the state to the so-called rights of the Church. It is no mere accident that the heyday of sacerdotal pretensions coincided with the golden age of the religious orders, that the Hildebrandine policy took shape when the Cluniac movement was overflowing the borders of France into all the adjacent countries, that Alexander III was a younger contemporary of St. Bernard, and that the death grapple between empire and papacy followed hard upon the foundation of the mendicant fraternities by St. Francis and St. Dominic. The monks and the friars were the militia of the Church. Not that the medieval orders devoted themselves to a political propaganda with the zeal and system of the Jesuits in the 16th century. The services which the Cluniacs and the Cistercians, the Dominicans and the Franciscans rendered to the militant papacy were more impalpable and indirect. From time to time, it is true, they were entrusted with important missions: to raise money, to preach a crusade, to influence monarchs, to convert or to persecute the heretic. St. Bernard, the founder of Clairvaux and the incarnation of the monastic spirit, was for 20 years, 1133–1153, the oracle to whom pope after pope resorted for direction. But even in St. Bernard's time, and even when the reigning pope was his nominee or pupil, there was a certain divergence between the theories for which he stood and the actual policy of the Curia. It was, for example, against his better judgment, that he organized the Second Crusade in deference to the express commands of Pope Eugenius III, and on the other hand, the papacy preserved towards the pioneers of scholasticism an attitude which he thought unduly lenient. Rome was more broad-minded than Clairvaux, more alive to realities, more versed in statecraft and diplomacy, while Clairvaux fostered a nobler conception of the spiritual life and was more consistent in withholding the church from secular entanglements. The qualities which made the monk invaluable as a leader of public opinion also made him an incalculable, an intractable factor in political combinations. He was most useful as the missionary and the embodiment of an ecclesiastical idea which, unconsciously perhaps but nonetheless emphatically, attacked the foundations of the secular state. The founders of the great orders, whether they found their inspiration with St. Bernard in the rule of Benedict, or rather strove with St. Francis to follow literally the commission imposed by Christ upon his 12 apostles, returned upon a past in which the state and Caesar were nothing to the Christian but the powers that be. The monastic or mendicant order, designed as an exemplar of the Christian society, was a voluntary association governed by the common conscience, as expressed in the will of representative, chapters, and an elected superior. The absolute obedience of the monk or friar was self-imposed, the consequence of a vow only accepted from one who had felt the inner call and had tested it in a severe probation. In virtue of his self-surrender, he became dead to the world, a citizen of the kingdom of heaven upon earth. No secular duties could be lawfully demanded of him. He had migrated from the jurisdiction of the state to that of God. The religious orders claimed the right to be free from all subjection save that of the Church, as represented by the Pope. Though far from holding the state a superfluous invention, they regarded it as a divine instrument to curb the lawless passions of the laity. They demanded that all other ministers of God, from the archbishop to the humblest clerk in orders, should enjoy the same exemption as themselves on condition of accepting the same threefold obligation: poverty, obedience, chastity. It was consequently in the religious orders that the chief movements for reforming the medieval clergy found their warmest partisans, and the same school supplied the theoretical basis for each new claim of privilege. The orders were the salt of the Church, so long as they preserved the spirit of their founders. But they were also responsible for the insanely logical pretensions which characterized the Church's policy in the 13th and 14th centuries, and it was with reason that Wycliffe, the greatest medieval critic of the sacerdotal theory, attacked the mendicant orders as typifying all that was worst in the hierarchy of his age. Naturally enough, the monastic spirit has been often treated as an absolute antithesis to the lay statesmanship which it so bitterly opposed, but in fact they sprang from the same root of a discontent which was wholly reasonable with the anarchical conditions of the early Middle Ages. The religious reformer, stunned and bewildered by the wrongdoing of men and the manifest inequity of fortune, argued that a world so irredeemably bad must be regarded as an ordeal for the faith of the believer. Man was afflicted in this life that he might realize the supreme value of the life to come. He was surrounded by evil that he might learn to hate it. He was placed in society that he might school himself to control the immoral and non-moral instincts which society calls into play. The political reformers, at least in their more disinterested moods, were animated by the same belief in an all-wise providence, but drew different deductions from it. The God who created man as a social being could not have intended that society should remain perpetually unjust. He must have intended that it should approximate, however imperfectly, to the idea of justice which he has revealed. The state is a divine institution, and therefore man must do his best to reform the state. The lay ruler, as the representative of justice, is God's steward, and even in a sense, his priest. Frederick II, whom his contemporaries denounced as an apostate and blasphemer, only expressed in a particularly daring form the tradition of medieval royalty when he styled himself, or allowed his flatterers to style him, the cornerstone of the Church, the Vicar of God, the new Messiah. Similarly, the heretics and rationalists, whose criticism was even more dangerous to the Church than the open violence of the state, had more in common with their opponents than we should infer from the duration and the character of the disputes which they provoked. In the background of medieval history, and developing pari passu with the feud of papacy and empire, there was a war of arguments and persecution against free thought, in which the religious orders figured as the protagonists of orthodoxy. Berengar of Tours, who challenged the doctrine of transubstantiation and so endangered the basis of the sacerdotal theory, lived in the age when a regenerated papacy was arming for the war on secularism. It was Hildebrand himself who pronounced the final sentence on the first of the heresiarchs. The age of Henry V and of the Concordat of Worms saw the rise of a medieval Puritanism in Languedoc and Flanders. Between the Concordat of Worms and the schism of Frederick Barbarossa lies the age of Abelard, the metaphysical freelance who made philosophy the talk of the street corner and the marketplace, and of Arnold of Brescia, who demanded that the Church should be reduced to apostolic poverty. To the youthful days of Frederick II belong the Albigensian Crusade, the futile campaign of authority against Averroes and Aristotle, the heresy hunts of volunteer inquisitors in Italy and Germany. While the same emperor was trying conclusions, with Innocent IV, the papal inquisition became a permanent branch of the ecclesiastical executive, and the mendicant orders, who supplied the inquisitors, simultaneously took upon themselves the harder task of converting the universities from the cult of Aristotle to a belief in the Christian scholasticism formulated by Albertus Magnus and Aquinas. The weapons of this interminable and many-sided controversy were as rude as the age which forged them. On the one side, coarse invective and irreverent paradox. On the other, scandalous imputations, spiritual censures, the sword, the prison and the stake. For the medieval attitude towards heterodoxy was unflinching and uncompromising. To remain skeptical when the Church had defined was as the sin of witchcraft or idolatry. The existence of the rebel was an insult to the Most High, a menace to the salvation of the simple. He was a diseased limb of the body politic, calling for sharp surgery. And yet these nonconformists were anything but unbelievers. The freethinkers of the schools, apart from a few obscure eccentrics, only desired to find a rational basis for the common creed, or to eliminate from it certain articles which, on moral grounds and grounds of history, they stigmatized as mere interpolations. The offense of Berengar was that he attacked a dogma which had been an open question within the last 200 years. Of Abelard, that he offered his own theories on some points in regard to which the orthodox tradition was mute or inconsistent. As for the sectaries, their offense usually consisted in exaggerating one or other of three doctrines, which the Church acknowledged in a more moderate shape. Either, like the poor men of Lyons, they desired that the Church should return to primitive simplicity, or, like the Albigeois, they harped upon the Pauline antithesis between the spirit and the flesh, pushed to extremes the monastic contempt for earthly ties, and exalted the Christian devil to the rank of an evil deity, supreme in the material universe. Or finally, with Joachim of Corazzo and the Fraticelli, they developed the cardinal idea of the more orthodox mystics, the belief in the inner light, and taught that the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. In short, all were guilty, not of repudiating Christianity, but of interpreting the Christian doctrine in a sense forbidden by authority. Beneath all differences, there was unity. Behind the controversy, agreement. There are no feuds more bitter, no recriminations more unjust than those of men who look at the same faith from different sides. In justice to the official Church, it must be remembered that, whether she had to deal with kings or heretics, the peculiar nature of her power forced her to work through instruments which she was powerless to keep in hand, and in which she had placed her confidence with the temerity of desperation. There can be no greater contrast than that between the Hildebrandine program and the measures by which it was incompletely realized. To enforce the celibacy of the clergy, the mobs of Milan and the South German cities were commissioned to rabble married priests. To make an end of simony, the German princes were encouraged in a policy of provincial separatism. A premium was placed on perjured accusations, and a son was suborned to betray his father. That the tide of the Albigensian heresy might be stemmed, Innocent III launched against the brilliant civilization of Languedoc the brutal and avaricious feudalism of the north. Sometimes the error was recognized after it had been committed, but no experience could cure the official church of the delusion that every volunteer must be credited with the purest motives until the contrary is proved. The same ignorance of human nature characterized her methods of administrative routine. Even if, for the sake of argument, we admit the truth of the principles which were alleged to justify the papal inquisition, or the censorship of the bishops, courts, or the appellate jurisdiction of the curia, the fact remains that these institutions were so organized and so conducted that the most flagrant abuses were only to be expected. A system which, if staffed with saints, would have been barely tolerable, became iniquitous when it was committed to the charge of petty officials, ill-paid, ill-supervised, and ill-selected. To a great extent, the crimes and follies of the medieval church were those of a complex bureaucracy in a half-civilized state. Such a system fails through being too ambitious. The founders have neither the technical experience requisite for a satisfactory arrangement of details, nor the subordinates who can repair the defects of the machine by the efficiency and honesty with which they tend it. And yet, because the aim is grandiose, because the supporters of the scheme proclaim their readiness and their capacity to regenerate the state and human nature, they are hailed as the prophets of a new order. They are allowed to plead the excellence of their motives in extenuation of all and any means. And they end by creating new evils without appreciably diminishing the old. But if the church as a scheme of government was a doubtful blessing to those who gave her their allegiance, the church as a home of spiritual life was invested with a grandeur and a charm which were and are apparent, even to spectators standing at the outer verge of her domain. We may compare the religion of the Middle Ages to an alpine range, on the lower slopes of which the explorer finds himself entangled in the mire and undergrowth of pathless thickets, oppressed by a still and stifling atmosphere, shut off from any view of the sky above or the pleasant plains beneath. Ascending through this sheltered and ignoble wilderness, he comes to free and windswept pastures, to the white solitude of virgin snowfields, to brooding glens and soaring peaks robed in the light or darkness of a mystery which he is as little able to define as to resist. Far below him, illimitably vast and yet infinitely little, extends the prospect of the lower levels which, whether beautiful or sordid, are too remote to seem a part of the new world in which he finds himself, and strike his senses only as a foil and a background to the severer hues, the more majestic lines and contours of the snow-capped mountain ranges. On such heights of moral exaltation, the medieval mystics built their tabernacles and sang their Benedicite, calling all nature to bear witness with them that God in his heaven was very near, and all well with a universe which existed only to fulfill his word. It was a noble optimism, and those who embraced it are the truest poets of the Middle Ages, none the less poets because they expressed their high imaginings in life instead of language. Philosophers they neither were nor sought to be. The temperament which feels the mystery of things most keenly is not that which probes into the how and why, but the world of their dreams was at least superior to ours in being founded upon an ever-present and overwhelming reverence for the truth behind the veil. The vision of the mountain peaks, however clouded, was worth the toil of the ascent. And there was reason in the docility with which the vulgar bowed themselves before the forms and ceremonies and rules of outward conduct which the visible church prescribed, since they believed that so they might find the way, in this life or a better, to that higher rule of service, exemplified in the finest characters of their experience, which, as Scripture said and the saints testified, was perfect life and freedom. It is no wonder that they were disposed to go further still, to stake their earthly fortunes and the future of society on the bidding of those among the elect who from time to time descended among them, like Moses from the mountain, with transfigured faces and the message of a new revelation. And if the result was sometimes calamitous or pitiable, there were compensating gains. A matter-of-fact prosperity is not altogether preferable to enlistment in the forlorn hope of idealism. Had medieval society been more consistently secular and skeptical, it might have been more prosperous, more stable, the nursery of more balanced natures and the theatre of more orderly careers. But there would have been the less to learn from the ethical and political conceptions of the age. What appeals to us in the medieval outlook upon life is, first, the idea of mankind as a brotherhood transcending racial and political divisions, united in a common quest for truth, filled with the spirit of mutual charity and mutual helpfulness, and endowed with a higher will and wisdom than that of the individuals who belong to it. Secondly, a profound belief in the superiority of right over might, of spirit over matter, of the eternal interests of humanity over the ambitions and the passions of the passing hour. Without Christianity, these articles of faith could scarcely have passed into the common heritage of men, and without the Church, it is in the last degree improbable that Christianity would have survived that age of semi-barbarism in which the foundations of the modern world were laid. Between the years 1100 and 1500 AD, the state system of Europe passed through changes amounting in their sum total to a revolution. But the changes which endured, whether they affected political boundaries or constitutions, came about by slow installments. At no stage of the development was there any general cataclysm, such as had followed the dissolution of the Frankish Empire, and was to follow the advent of Napoleon. New ideas matured slowly in the medieval mind. By the 12th century, the forces making for social stability had grown until they balanced those of disruption, and it was only in the age of the Renaissance that the equilibrium was again destroyed. In the interim, the vested interests of property and privilege, of religious and secular authority, presented a firm front to the anarchists and radicals. The Jacquerie in France, and Wat Tyler's followers in England, the Albigeois of Languedoc and the Hussites of Bohemia, were overwhelmed by armies of conservatives spontaneously banded together in defense of the established order. While this spirit prevailed among the ruling classes, there was little fear that a revolution of any kind would be affected by a sudden stroke. As in domestic politics, so too in international relations, these solidly established states were habitually inert, strong in defense, but irresolute and sluggish in attack. The age produced no conqueror to sweep through Europe like a whirlwind, because the implements of conquest on the grand scale had either been destroyed or had not yet come into existence. The peoples of Europe had emerged from the nomadic stage of culture, and they were not yet organized as so many armed camps. The feudal host was hard to mobilize, harder still to keep in the field, and at the best an unmanageable weapon. A standing army of mercenary soldiers would have called for taxation heavier and more regular than any ruler dared to demand, or any people could afford to pay. The wars of the Middle Ages have therefore, with few exceptions, a stamp of futility and pettiness. Ambitious enterprises were foredoomed to failure, and powers apparently annihilated by an invading host recovered strength as soon as it had rolled away. In short, on the European and on the national stage alike, medieval politics meant the eternal recurrence of the same problems and disputes, the eternal repetition of the same palliatives and the same plan of campaign. It is true that political science made more progress than the art of war, but substantial reforms of institutions were effected only in a few exceptional communities, in Sicily under the Normans and Frederick II, in England under Henry II, and Edward III, in France under Philip Augustus and his successors. Even in these cases, the progress usually consists in elaborating some primitive expedient, in developing some accepted principle to the logical conclusion. The more audacious innovators, a Montfort, an Artevelde, a Frederick II, were tripped up and overthrown as soon as they stepped beyond the circle of conventional ideas. It will therefore suffice for our present purpose to state in the barest outline the leading events of international politics, and the chief advances in the theory of government, which extensive diplomatic combinations, though continually planned, seldom came to the birth and very rarely led to any notable result. The existence of some common interests was recognized. No power viewed with indifference any movement threatening. The existence of the papacy, which represented religious unity, or of the crusading principalities which formed the outer bulwark of Western Christendom, the principle of the balance of power, though not yet crystallized into a dogma, was so far understood that the inordinate growth of any single power alarmed the rest, even though they stood in no imminent danger of absorption. Therefore, whenever the empire gained the upper hand over the church, whenever a new horde of Asiatics appeared on the horizon, whenever France seemed about to become a province of England, or Italy a province of France, the alarm was sounded by the publicists, and there ensued a general interchange of views between the monarchies. Treaty was piled on treaty. Alliance parried with alliance, as industriously as at any time in modern history. But the people seldom moved, and the agitation of the ruling classes effervesced in words. It is altogether exceptional to find two of the greater states uniting for the humiliation of a third, as England and the Empire united against Philip Augustus of France. Few medieval battles were so far-reaching in their consequences as Bouvines, or in 1214, to which England owes her Magna Carta, Germany the magnificent and stormy autumn of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, France the consolidation of her long-divided provinces under an absolutist monarchy. At ordinary times, there were in medieval Europe two groups of states with separate interests and types of polity. They were divided from one another by a broad belt of debatable territory, extending from Holland to the coast of Provence, the northern lands of the Carolingian Middle Kingdom. To the west lay the monarchies of the Iberian Peninsula, of France, England, and Scotland, connected by their interest in the trade of the Atlantic seaboard, by a common civilization in which the best elements were of French origin, but most of all by their preoccupation with the political questions arising out of England's claim to a good half of the territory of France. The rivalry of these two great powers, which dated in a rudimentary form from the Norman conquest of England, became acute when Henry II, heir in his mother's right to England and Normandy, in that of his father to Anjou and Touraine, married Eleanor, the Duchess of Aquitaine, and the divorced wife of Louis VII, 1152. Developing from one stage to another, it alternately made and unmade the fortunes of either nation for 400 years, until Charles VII of France brought his wars of reconquest to a triumphant conclusion by crushing, in Guyenne, the last remnants of the English garrison and of the party which clung to the English allegiance, 1453. In the interval there had been sharp vicissitudes of failure and success. The expulsion of the English by Philip Augustus from Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Touraine, and Poitou, the capture of Calais and recovery of Aquitaine by Edward III, and the Black Prince, the almost complete undoing of their work by Charles V and Bertrand du Guesclin, the union of the French and English crowns, 1420, resulting from the victories of Henry V, and the murderous feud of the Burgundian and Armagnac factions, the apparition of Jeanne d'Arc as the prophetess of French nationalism, and the regeneration of the French monarchy by a new race of scientific statesmen. All the West had been shaken by this secular duel. For Scotland it spelled independence, for Navarre the loss of independence. In Castile it set on the throne the new dynasty of Trastamare. To Aragon the result was the appearance of a new rival. In Mediterranean commerce, the frustration of hopes which had centred round Provence and Languedoc, the imperiling of others which were fixed on Italy. With each successive triumph of French over English arms, the influence of France penetrated farther to the south and east, and by the marriages or military successes of princes of the French blood royal, new territories were joined to the sphere of the Western nations. Under Saint Louis, the counties of Toulouse and Provence became French appanages. His brother, Charles of Anjou, added to Provence the derelict kingdom of Naples, and Sicily only escaped from the rule of the Angevins by submission to the House of Aragon. After the victories of Charles V, the Valois Dukes of Burgundy, supported by the influence now of France and now of England, sketch the outlines of a new Middle Kingdom, stretching from the Jura to the Zuider Zee, and chiefly composed of lands which had hitherto been attached to the empire. Illustration: France. The eastern group of nations is widely different in character. It includes a greater number of states, even if we omit from the reckoning the great German principalities, which were, by the end of the Middle Ages, all but sovereign powers, and it is less homogeneous in culture. The empire forms the center of the group, and round the empire the minor states are grouped like satellites. On the west, Savoy and Provence; south of the Alps, Venice, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Sicily, the last named independent until 1194, and the private property of the Hohenstaufen from that date till 1268. On the east, the kingdoms of Hungary and Bohemia and Poland, and the Russian principalities. On the north, the three Scandinavian powers. Large as it is, this group only includes one state of the first rank, for the Norman kingdom, though a masterpiece of constructive statesmanship, was important in European politics rather as a second and a make-weight than as a principal, and would have been more admired than feared but for the accidents which made the Norman alliance so valuable to the Holy See. When Naples and Sicily were held by German emperors, the empire towered like a colossus above the states of Scandinavia, the Slav and the Magyar. But even without this support, the empire might have continued to dominate 2/3 of Europe if the imperial resources had not been swallowed up by the wars of Italy, and if the emperors who came after the interregnum had given the national interest priority over those of their own families. In fact, however, the mischief of the Mezentian union between Italy and Germany survived their separation. As in Western, so in Central Europe, the course of political development was largely determined by the persistent and disastrous efforts of a Teutonic to absorb a Latin nationality. But whereas the English attacks on France were directly responsible for the growth of a French national state, the failure of Germany left Italy but half emancipated from the foreigner and more disintegrated than she had been at any period in the past. And whereas England, by her failure, was reduced for a while to a secondary rank among the nations, the purely German Empire of the 15th century was still the leading power east of the Rhine. This was partly the result of calamities to neighbouring nations which could neither be foreseen or obviated. While Western Europe was shielded, in the later Middle Ages, from the inroads of alien races, Eastern Europe felt the impact of the last migratory movements emanating from Central Asia and the Muslim lands. In the 13th century, the advance guards of the Mongol Empire destroyed the medieval Kingdom of Poland and reduced the Russian princes to dependence upon the rulers of the Golden Horde. In the 15th, the advance of the Turks along the Danube completed the ruin of the Magyar state, already weakened by the feuds of aristocratic factions. But, apart from these favourable circumstances, the resources of Germany were irresistible when they could be concentrated. Twice after the Great Interregnum, the integrity of the empire was threatened by the Bohemian kingdom. On the first occasion, when Ottokar II had extended his power into the German lands between Bohemia and the Adriatic, he was overthrown by Rudolf of Habsburg at the Battle of the Marchfeld, 1278, and a new Habsburg principality was formed out of the reconquered lands to guard the southeast frontier against future incursions of Czech or Magyar. On the second, when the Hussite levies carried their devastations and their propaganda into all the neighbouring provinces of the empire, 1424, 1434, crusade after crusade was launched against Bohemia until the heretics, uniformly victorious in the field, were worn out by the strain of their exertions against superior numbers. And all the more moderate spirits recognized that such triumphs must end in the ruin and depopulation of Bohemia. The case was the same in the Baltic, where the struggle with Danish ambitions was left to the princes and the free towns. Waldemar II, 1202-1241, who had planned to revive the Scandinavian empire of the Great Canute, the conqueror of England, saw his ambitious edifice crumble to pieces while it was still in the making. Even the Union of Kalmar, 1397, by which the crowns of Norway and Sweden and Denmark were vested in a single dynasty, could not save the rich prize of the Baltic trade from falling into German hands. Germany, even when ill-governed and a prey, to the ambitions of provincial dynasties was still grand chose et terrible, as more than one political adventurer learned to his cost. The energy, the intelligence, and the national spirit of a great people made good all the errors of statesmen and all the defects of institutions. Illustration: Holy Roman Empire under Frederick Barbarossa. Late in the 15th century, the Germans were mortified to discover that, although a nation, they had not become a state. They found that the center of political power had shifted westward, that the destinies of Europe were now controlled by the French, the English, and the Spaniards. These nations had perfected a new form of autocracy, more vigorous, more workmanlike in structure than any medieval form of government. Germany, in the meanwhile, had clung to all that was worst and feeblest in the old order. Her monarchy and the institutions connected with it had been reduced to impotence. The same process of decay had operated in the minor states of the Eastern Group. In Scandinavia, in Hungary, in the Slavonic lands, the tree of royal power was enveloped and strangled by the undergrowth of a bastard feudalism, by the territorial power of aristocracies which, under cover of administrative titles, converted whole provinces into family estates and claimed over their tenants the divine right of unlimited and irresponsible sovereignty. To investigate all the reasons for the political backwardness of these Eastern peoples would carry us far afield. But one reason lies on the surface. Outside the free towns, they had produced no middle class, and their towns were neither numerous nor wealthy enough to be important in national politics. They were not even represented in the national assemblies. In consequence, the sovereigns of these states were obliged to govern by the help of aristocratic factions, to purchase recognition by the grant of larger and larger privileges, and for the sake of power to strip themselves of the resources which alone could give their power any meaning. But good government in the Middle Ages was only another name for a public-spirited and powerful monarchy. Such monarchies existed in the Western states. They rested upon the shoulders of a middle class of small landowners and wealthy merchants, too weak to defend themselves in a state of nature, a war of all against all, but collectively strong enough to overawe the forces of anarchy. It may seem strange that this class, which desired strong government for purely practical and material reasons, should uniformly have accepted hereditary kingship as the one form of government practicable in a large community. Even where there was the warrant of tradition for recourse to free election, the better governed states preferred that the supreme power should pass automatically from father to son. The explanation is to be found in the motives which prompted the Athenians, under widely different circumstances, to choose their magistrates by lot. The grand danger, to be avoided at all costs, was that a disputed succession would leave the daily work of government in abeyance and open the door for destructive party conflicts. If continuity and stability of government were assured, all would go well. The work of a ruler was not supposed to demand exceptional abilities. He existed to do justice, to secure every man in the possession of his own, to apply the law without respect of persons. For these purposes, a high sense of duty was the main requisite. The wisest heads of the community would be at the king's service for the asking. He could hardly go wrong if he heard attentively and weighed impartially the counsel which they had to offer. Admitting that he would be all the more efficient for possessing some practical capacity, some experience of great affairs, was it not probable that a man of average intelligence, who had been trained from his youth to fill the kingly office, would acquit himself better than some self-made adventurer of genius who had paid more attention to the arts of winning place and popularity than to the work that would be thrown upon him when he reached the goal of his ambition? When we further recollect that hereditary kingship was sanctioned by use and wont, was the most intelligible symbol of national unity, and possessed as of right all the prerogatives which were necessary for effective government, it is no wonder that even those to whom doctrines of popular sovereignty and a social contract were perfectly familiar acquiesced contentedly in a form of government which the modern world regards as unreasonable and essentially precarious. But a monarchy, however energetic, however public-spirited, was powerless until based on the firm foundations of an organized executive, an expert judicature, and an assembly representative in fact if not in form. No medieval state was so uniformly fortunate as Germany in finding kings of exceptional character and talent. Yet Germany, from the beginning to the end of the Middle Ages, was badly governed. This was not due solely to the circumstance that the German monarchy was in principle elective. It is true that the German crown was often purchased by ill-advised concessions, but a greater source of weakness was the inability of the emperors to make the most of the prerogatives which they retained and which the nation desired that they should exercise. Imperial justice was dilatory and inefficient because the imperial law court followed the emperor, because the professional was liable to be overruled by the feudal element among the judges, because the rules of procedure were uncertain and the decisions based not upon a scientific jurisprudence but on provincial custom. The diet of the empire was weak, both in deliberation and as a legislature, because the towns and the lesser nobility had no respect for resolutions in framing which they had not been consulted. The executive was necessarily inefficient or unpopular, because the highest offices were claimed as a right by princes who, if laymen, owed their rank to the accident of birth, or, if ecclesiastics, could only be good servants of the state by becoming unworthy servants of the church. The emperor who confided in his natural counsellors was ill-served, and if he relied upon new men, selected solely for their loyalty and qualifications, he incurred the reproach of tyranny or submission to unworthy favourites. The evils thus rooted in the German constitution had existed at an earlier date in France and England. To eradicate them was the object of the constitutional changes devised by the Plantagenets in England, by the later Capetian kings in France, and in essentials there is a strong likeness between the work of the two dynasties. But in England, the policy of construction was earlier adopted, proceeded more rapidly, and produced an edifice which was more durable because established on a broader basis. The first stage of the policy was to organize the administration of those parts of each kingdom which, not having been absorbed in privileged fiefs, were still subject to the royal justice and contributory to the royal revenue. Owing to the foresight of William the Conqueror, there were few such fiefs in England. Only in two Palatine earldoms, Durham and Cheshire, on the Welsh and northern borders, and on the lands of a few prelates, was the king permanently cut off from immediate contact with the subject population. With these exceptions, the face of England was divided into shires and administered by sheriffs who were nominees of the crown, dismissible at pleasure. The shires again were divided into hundreds governed under the sheriff by subordinate officials. But for the most important duties of executive routine, the sheriff alone was responsible. He collected the revenue, he led the militia, he organized the watch and ward, and hue and cry, which were the medieval equivalents for a constabulary. Finally, he presided over the shire moot, in which the freeholders gathered at stated intervals to declare justice and receive it. The shires were periodically visited by justices in eyre, analogous to the Frankish misai, who heard complaints against the sheriff, inspected his administration, tried criminals, and heard those civil suits, particularly cases of freehold, which were deemed sufficiently important to be reserved for their decision. These itinerant commissioners were selected from the staff of the royal law court, Curia Regis, a tribunal which, in the 13th century, was subdivided into the three courts of common law and acquired a fixed domicile at Westminster. The shire courts and the royal court were alike bound by the statute law so far as it extended, but in the larger half of their work, they had no guides save the local custom, as expounded by the good men of the shire court, and the decisions recorded on the rolls of the royal court. From the latter source was derived the English common law, a system of precedents which, in spite of curious subtleties and technicalities, remains the most striking monument of medieval jurisprudence. In and after the 14th century, it was supplemented by equity, the law of the Chancellor's Court, to which those suitors might repair whose grievances could not be remedied at common law, but were held worthy of special redress by the king, in his character of a patron and protector of the defenceless. Lastly, on the fiscal side, the work of the sheriffs and of the judges was supervised by the exchequer, a chamber of audit and receipt, to which the sheriffs rendered a half-yearly statement, and in which were prepared the articles of inquiry for the itinerant justices. Originally a branch of the Curia Regis and a tribunal as well as a treasury, the Exchequer always remains in close connection with the judicial system, since one of the three courts of common law is primarily concerned with suits which affect the royal revenue. Such was the English scheme of administration, and mutatis mutandis, it was reproduced in France. Here the royal domain, small in the 11th and 12th centuries, was enormously enlarged by the annexations of Philip Augustus and the later Capets, who brought under their immediate control the larger part of the Angevin inheritance, the great fiefs of Toulouse and Champagne, and many smaller territories. To provide for the government of these acquisitions, there was built up, in the course of the 13th century, an administrative hierarchy consisting of provosts who correspond to the bailiffs of English hundreds, of bailies and seneschaux who resemble the English sheriffs, of enquêteurs who perambulate the domain, making inspections and holding sessions in the same manner as the English justices in Eyre. All these functionaries are controlled, from the time of St. Louis, by the Chambre des Comptes and the Parlement, the one a fiscal department, the other a supreme court of first instance and appeal. Within the Parlement, there is a distinction between the courts of common law and the Chambre des Recoutes, which deals with petitions by the rules of equity. The vices of both systems were the same. The local officials were too powerful within their respective spheres. Neither inspectors nor royal courts proved adequate as safeguards against corruption and abuses of authority, which were the more frequent because the vicious expedients of farming and selling offices had become an established practice. Otherwise, the English system was superior to that of France, particularly in making use for certain purposes of local representatives as an additional check upon the servants of the crown. The English shire was in fact, as well as in law, a community, with a true corporate character, communitas, and possessed a public assembly, which was a law court and a local parliament in one. Though the ordinary suitor counted for little, the secondary landowners, united by ties of local sentiment and personal relationship, took a lively interest and an active share in the business of the shire court, upholding the local custom against sheriffs and judges, serving as jurors, as assessors of taxes, as guardians of the peace, and, from the 14th century, as petty magistrates. Whether elected by their fellows or the nominees of the crown, these functionaries were unpaid and regarded themselves as the defenders of local liberty against official usurpations. In France, the district of the bailli, and still more that of his subordinate the prévôt, was an arbitrary creation, without natural unity or corporate sentiment. There was therefore no organized resistance to executive authority, and no reason why the crown should court the goodwill of the landed gentry. In the lower grades of the Plantagenet system, a powerful middle class served a political apprenticeship. Under the Capets, all power and responsibility were jealously reserved to the professional administrator. In England, the next step in constitutional development, the addition to the National Assembly of a third estate, was brilliantly successful, since the House of Commons was chiefly recruited from families which had long been active partners in local administration. In France, the third estate, though constantly summoned in the 14th century, proved itself politically impotent. Both in France and in England, after 1066, the National Assembly began as a feudal council, composed of the prelates and barons, who held their lands and dignities directly from the crown. But that of France was, before the 12th century, seldom convened, sparsely attended, and generally ignored by the greater feudatories, a conference of partisans rather than a parliament. In England, the great council of the Norman dynasty, inheriting the prestige and the claims of the Anglo-Saxon Witenagemot, held from the first a more respectable position. Even a William the Fur or a Henry II scrupulously adhered to the principle of consulting his magnates on projects of legislation or taxation. Under the sons and grandson of Henry II, the pretensions of the assembly were enlarged and more pertinaciously asserted. The difficulties of the crown were the opportunity of church and baronage. The Great Council now claimed to appoint and dismiss the royal ministers, to withhold pecuniary aid and military service until grievances had been redressed, to limit the prerogative and even to put it in commission when it was habitually abused. In fact, the English nobility of this period, thwarted as individuals in their ambitions of territorial power, found in their collective capacity, as members of the opposition in the council, a new field of enterprise and self-aggrandizement. In France, there was no such parliamentary movement because the fundamental presupposition of success was wanting, because it was hopeless to appeal to public opinion against a successful and venerated monarchy in the name of an assembly which had never commanded popular respect. Under these circumstances, it was natural that very different consequences should ensue in the two countries when the reformation of their national assemblies was taken in hand by Edward I and his contemporary Philippe le Bel. The problem before the two sovereigns was the same: to create an assembly which should be recognized as competent to tax the nation. The solutions which they adopted were closely alike. Representatives of the free towns were brought into the États généraux of free towns and shires into the English Parliament. In each case, a third estate was grafted upon a feudal council. But the products of the two experiments were different in temper and in destiny. The States General, practically a new creation, neither knew what powers to claim or how to vindicate them. They turned the power of the purse to little or no account. They discredited themselves in the eyes of the nation by giving proofs of feebleness and indecision in the first great crisis with which they were called to deal. The interregnum of anarchy and conspiracy that ensued upon the capture of King John at Poitiers, 1356. The result was that the States General, occasionally summoned to endorse the policy or register the decrees of the monarchy, remained an ornamental feature of the French Constitution. In England, on the other hand, the Commons accepted the position of auxiliaries to the superior estates in their contests with the Crown, and the new Parliament pursued the aims and the tactics of the old Great Council, with all the advantages conferred by an exclusive right to grant taxation. For more than 200 years, it was a popular assembly in form and in pretension alone. The most active members of the lower house were drawn from the lower ranks of the territorial aristocracy, and the Commons were bold in their demands only when they could attack the prerogative behind the shield of a faction quartered in the House of Lords. But the alliance of the houses transformed the character of English politics. Before Parliament had been in existence for 2 centuries, it had deposed 5 kings and conferred a legal title upon 3 new dynasties. It had indicated to posterity the lines upon which an absolutism could be fought and ruined without civil war, and it had proved that the representative element in the Constitution might overrule both monarchy and aristocracy, if it had the courage to carry accepted principles to their logical conclusion. Even in England, a medieval parliament was scarcely a legislature in our sense of the word. Legislation of a permanent and general kind was an occasional expedient. New laws were usually made in answer to the petitions of the estates, but the laws were framed by the king and the crown lawyers, and often took a form which by no means expressed the desires of the petitioners. The most important changes in the law of the land were not made, but grew through the accumulated effect of judicial decisions. The chief function of parliaments, after the voting of supplies, was to criticize and to complain, to indicate the shortcomings of a policy which they had not helped to make. Except as the guardians of individual liberty, they cannot be said to have made medieval government more scientific or efficient. In the 15th century, the English Commons criticised the government of the Lancastrian dynasty with the utmost freedom. But it was left for Yorkist and Tudor despots to diagnose aright the maladies of the body politic. Englishmen and Frenchmen alike were well advised when, at the close of the Middle Ages, they committed the task of national reconstruction to sovereigns who ignored or circumvented parliamentary institutions. A parliament was admirable as a check, or a balance, as a symbol of popular sovereignty, as a school of political intelligence. But no parliament that had been brought together in any medieval state was fitted to take the lead in shaping policy or in reforming governmental institutions. Neither the internal development of the medieval state nor the international politics of medieval Europe can be explained without constant reference to class distinctions. First, there is a sharp line dividing each state horizontally and marking off the privileged few from the unprivileged many. the rulers from the ruled. Below, the line are the traders, artisans, and cultivators of the soil. Above it, the landlords, the office holders, and the clergy. If an industrial community, here and there a Milan or a Ghent, succeeds in asserting political independence, the phenomenon is regarded as anomalous and revolutionary. Still graver is the head-shaking when mere peasants, like the Swiss, throw off what is called their natural allegiance. And such cases of successful rebellion are rare. It is true that in England, in France, and in the Spanish kingdoms there are privileged towns which receive the right of representation in national assemblies. But this concession to the power of the purse is strictly limited. The spokesman of the burgesses are not invited to express opinions until asked for subsidies or military aid. Government is the affair of the king and the privileged classes. But again, there is a division within the privileged classes, a vertical line of cleavage between the various grades of the lay and clerical aristocracies. The prelate and the baron, the knight and the priest, harmonious enough when it is a question of teaching the unprivileged their place, are rivals for social influence and political power, are committed to conflicting theories of life. The ecclesiastic, enrolled in an order which is recruited from every social grade, makes light of secular rank and titles. He claims precedence over every layman. He holds that it is the business of the church to command, of princes to obey. The lay feudatory, born into a hereditary caste of soldiers, regards war as the highest vocation for a man of honor, is impatient of priestly arrogance, and believes in his heart that the church ought not to meddle with politics. It would be a mistake to think of the two privileged classes as always at strife with one another and their social inferiors. But the great wars of Pope and Emperor, the 14th century revolts of French and English peasants, are not events which come suddenly and unexpectedly. Each such outbreak is like the eruption of a volcano, a symptom of subterranean forces continually in conflict. The state of peace in medieval society was a state of tension. Equilibrium meant the unstable balance of centralizing and centrifugal forces. And this was one reason why wars, condemned in the abstract by the Church, were frequently regarded with favor by sober statesmen and by idealists. In more ways than one, a successful war might serve to heal or salve the feuds of rival classes. It offered an outlet for the restless and anarchic energies of feudalism. Sometimes it ended in conquests with which the landless could be permanently endowed. It might offer new markets to the merchant, a field of emigration to the peasant, a new sphere of influence to the national clergy. Better still, it might evoke common sentiments of patriotism or religion, and create in all classes the consciousness of obligations superior to merely selfish interests. Such statecraft may perhaps seem rude and barbarous to us. The idea of a nation as a system of classes and of national unity as a condition only to be realized when all classes combine for some purpose, extraneous to the everyday life of the nation, is foreign to our thought. We believe that by making war upon class privileges, we have given to the state a less divided and more organic character. We maintain that the state exists to realize an immanent ideal, which we express by some such formula as the greatest good, of the greatest number. But we are still so far from a reconciliation of facts with theories that we must hesitate before utterly condemning the medieval attitude towards war. In place of classes, we have interests, which are hard to unite and, often at open variance. Our statesmen balance one interest against another and consider war legitimate when it offers great advantages to the interests most worth conciliating. Nor have we yet succeeded in giving to the average citizen so elevated a conception of the purpose for which the state exists that he can think of national policy as something different from national selfishness. It is easier to criticize the enthusiasts who urged medieval nations to undertake some work of noble note, remote from daily routine, than it is to discover and to preach a nobler enterprise on behalf of a less visionary ideal. It helps us to understand, though it does not compel us to accept, the medieval theory when we find modern poets and preachers glorifying war as a school of patriotism or of national character. Wars of conquest were less frequent in the Middle Ages than we might expect, and were usually waged on a small scale. Their comparative infrequency, in an age of militarism, must be explained by reference both to current morality and to economic conditions. For an attack upon a Christian power, it was necessary that some just cause should be alleged. Public opinion, educated by the Church to regard Western Christendom as a single commonwealth, demanded that some respect should be shown to the ordinary moral code, even in international relations. Furthermore, the medieval state, loosely knit together and bristling with isolated fortresses, showed in defeat the tenacious vitality of the lower organisms, and could not be entirely reduced without an expenditure on the invader's part, which the methods of medieval state finance were powerless to meet. Edward the Fan failed to conquer the petty kingdom of Scotland, and the French provinces, which were ceded to Edward III, escaped from his grasp in a few years. The profitable wars were border wars waged against the disunited tribes of Eastern Europe, or the decadent Moslem states of the Mediterranean, and such wars were of common occurrence, sometimes undertaken by the nationalities most favourably situated for the purpose, sometimes by self-expatriated emigrants in search of a new home. Thanks to the teaching of the Church, a large proportion of the border wars were converted into crusades for the propagation of the faith, or the extermination of the unbeliever, or the defence of holy places. Often enough, the religious motive was introduced as an afterthought and gave a thin veil of respectability to operations which it would otherwise have been difficult to excuse. In some cases, however, those who enlisted as the soldiers of the Church were sacrificing their material interests for the good, as they supposed, of their own souls and the Christian commonwealth. There was nothing essentially Christian in this spirit of self-devotion. It had long been epidemic in the Mohammedan world and accounts for the most successful encroachments of Islam upon Europe and the Eastern Empire. The impulse affected Western Christendom for a relatively short period of time, only once or twice producing movements at all commensurable with those which had emanated from Arabia, Asia Minor and Africa, and leading to no conquests that can rank in magnitude with the caliphates of Baghdad, Cordova and Cairo. But the Christian crusade is in one sense more remarkable than the Mohammedan jihad. Western Europe had long ago emerged from the nomadic stage, and even the ruling classes of Western Christendom, cosmopolitan as they may seem to us, were attached to their native soil by many ties. If the upheaval was smaller in the West than in the East, the material to be set in motion was more stubborn and inert. The prizes to be held before the eyes of the believer were more impalpable and dubious. There were ventures near at hand for which the Church could find volunteers without the slightest difficulty, but those which she was more particularly bent on forwarding were distant, hazardous, and irksome. The majority of the men who went on her great crusades had no prospect of any temporal advantage. In the end, those enterprises to which she gave her special countenance proved the least successful. It was not in the Eastern Mediterranean, but in Spain, in Lower Italy, and in Central Europe, that the frontiers of Western Christendom were permanently advanced. For the historian, however, the failures have an interest not inferior to that of the more productive enterprises. The age of border wars and border colonies begins long before the appearance of a true crusading spirit. In German history, the movement of expansion dates from Henry the Fowler. When he captured Brandenburg, 928, and annexed the heathen tribes between the Elbe and Oder, he inaugurated a policy of settlement and colonization, which the German margraves of those regions were to pursue, slowly and methodically, for more than 200 years. In its later stages, the policy was sometimes assisted by crusaders. From the first, it made many converts to Christianity, and was furthered by the foundation of frontier sees and churches subject to the German archbishops of Hamburg and Magdeburg. But the men who directed the policy were purely secular and selfish. The greatest of them, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony from 1142 to 1180, and Albert the Bear, Margrave of Brandenburg from 1134 to 1170, concentrated their energies upon the development and extension of their principalities, exploited the Slavs, plotted against one another and their Christian neighbours, neglected national interests, and frankly made the Church the instrument of their ambitions. Yet, in the craft of state building, they showed exceptional sagacity, enlisting as their allies the traders of the Baltic, the peasants of North Germany, and the Low Countries. Under their rule, and that of their most successful imitators, the Teutonic, Knights in Prussia, cities such as Lübeck, founded 1143, and Danzig, colonized 1308, became centers of German trade and culture, while the open country in the basins of the Elbe and Oder was covered with newly settled villages of German immigrants. The effects of this colonization have extended far beyond the lands immediately affected and the limits of medieval history. The new colonies laid the foundations of modern Prussia and modern Saxony. To their existence is due the connection of Poland and Bohemia with the state system of medieval Europe, and the consequent division of the Slavonic peoples into a Western and an Eastern group. The westward expansion of the Russian Empire was forestalled and prevented by these early pioneers of German and of Roman influence. Only less important was the German advance along the Danube, from the River Inn to Vienna and the Hungarian frontier, which was mainly directed by successive heads of the family of Babenberg, 971–1246, first as margraves and afterwards as dukes of Austria. The Habsburg power, like that of the Hohenzollerns, is partly an inheritance from medieval frontiersmen who drove a German wedge into the heart of a Slavonic territory. The history of these German colonies often reminds us how naturally such business ventures came to be regarded as a species of crusade. In 1147, a large body of German pilgrims, enlisted for the Second Crusade, were allowed to fulfill their vows by serving against the Slav in the armies of Saxony and Brandenburg. The Babenberg dukes, grown weary of their monotonous work on the Danube, roamed eastward to conquer Egypt, or Palestine, westward to exterminate the Albigensians of Languedoc and the infidels in Spain. And when we turn from Germany to the Spanish peninsula, the alliance between religious fervor and commercial enterprise is still more striking. The Christian reconquest of Spain and Portugal began 2 or 3 generations before the Council of Clermont. But from the first, the southward advance against the rulers of Cordova foreshadows the age of the Crusades. In Spain, as in the German Marks, the pioneers of Christendom were often ruffianly and always fought with an eye to the main chance. Among them are mere desperadoes like the Cid Campeador, d. 1099, who serves and betrays alternately the Christian and the Moorish causes, founds a principality at the expense of both religions, but is finally claimed as a hero and a martyr by his native Castile, because he has the good fortune to die in her allegiance. Many conquistadors of more reputable character settled down contentedly amongst a tributary and unconverted Moorish population, whose manners and vices they adopted. But in Spain, the racial antipathies of Moors and Christians were always aggravated by religious zeal. Several times it seemed as though Spanish Christianity was in danger of complete extinction. In the 10th century, 2 great rulers of Cordova, Abderrahman III and Al-Mansur, drove back the Castilians to the northern mountains and raided the inmost recesses of the Christian territories. Somewhat later, the wild Berber hordes of the Almoravides and the Almohads, crossing from Africa to usurp the Umayyad dominions and carry on the holy war with greater energy, aroused new fears and provoked in the threatened kingdoms a fanaticism equal to their own. The Spanish Christians appealed for help to their northern neighbours. Armies of volunteers from Normandy, from Aquitaine, and from Burgundy poured over the Myrones to strike a blow for the cross against the crescent, and incidentally to gain rich spoils or found a colony. The movement was early taken under the patronage of Rome. Gregory VII offered papal commissions to the immigrants, on condition that they would hold their conquests as vassals of the Holy See, 1073, and thenceforth each new enterprise against the Moors was officially recognized as a service to the Catholic Church. Still, even in Spain, the tendency was for material ambitions to gain the upper hand. All classes in the Christian kingdoms benefited by the wresting of a new province from the infidel. The nobles received new fiefs. The burghers flocked into the cities evacuated by the Moors, or were encouraged by large grants of privileges to build new cities. Round the cities clustered communities of peasants, who joyfully exchanged the barren security of the northern uplands for the risks and the prizes of the river valleys. No kings were so popular as those who planned and carried to a successful conclusion these ventures for the common good. One such ruler, James the Great of Aragon, has left us in his memoirs a faithful and instructive account of the use to which he and his subjects turned one of these so-called crusades. At 6 years of age, he had succeeded to a divided kingdom and the shadow of a royal prerogative. At 14, he began a hard struggle for the mastery of his rebellious barons and cities, which lasted 5 years and earned for him more credit than substantial success. When at length the rebels sued for peace, he was obliged to grant it without exacting compensation. The crown remained as poor after the victory as before it. A little later, he conceived the idea of attacking the Moors in the Balearic Isles, either to convert them and turn that kingdom to the faith of our Lord, or else to destroy them. He propounded his plan to the Cortes, 1229, and in a moment, dissension was changed to harmony, civil indifference to loyal enthusiasm. The barons said that to conquer a Saracen kingdom set in the sea would be the greatest deed done by Christians for 100 years. They would give an aid, they would find contingents, they would serve in person, always on the understanding that each should share in the spoils proportionately to the size of his contingent. The Archbishop of Tarragona, speaking for the clergy, said that now at last his eyes had seen the salvation of the Lord. He could not serve. He was too old for that. But his men and his money were the king's for this sacred undertaking, and he would gladly give a dispensation to any bishop or abbot who would go with the king, always provided that the clerical crusaders were to share in the booty on the same terms as the laymen. To the same purpose, with the same stipulation, spoke the trading cities. The expedition was a brilliant success. Majorca was reduced by the efforts of the whole expedition. Minorca capitulated without a struggle, and the Archbishop of Tarragona, by special license from the king, conquered Ivica for himself, but the Moors were neither extirpated nor converted. Those of Majorca became the tenants of the Crusaders, between whom that island was divided. Those of Minorca paid an annual tribute to the king. In both islands, they were guaranteed the use of their native customs and religion. Surveying the crusade many years after it was completed, James expresses the highest satisfaction with the results. From Minorca he receives not only the agreed tribute, but whatever else he chooses to demand. As for Majorca, the Lord has so increased it that it produces twice as much as in the days of Moorish rule. We are now in a position to understand the complex nature of the motives which animated the preachers, the generals, and the soldiers of the Crusades. For these enterprises are a continuation on a greater scale of the German, Spanish, and Norman wars of conquest. Like the wars of Spain, the Crusades were suggested by fears of a Mohammedan advance. The signal for the First Crusade was given by the successes of the Seljuk Turks under Alp Arslan and Malik Shah, 1071–1092. These uncivilized and fanatical usurpers of the Caliphate of Baghdad overran the whole of Asia Minor and of Syria in 20 years. They dealt a heavy blow to the Eastern Empire on the field of Manzikert, 1071, and founded in Asia Minor the Sultanate of Rum. They established smaller principalities in Syria. The rulers of Constantinople sent urgent appeals for help to the west, and pilgrims returning from the holy places complained loudly of the insults and persecutions by which the conquerors manifested their hostility to the Christian faith. Gregory VII, immediately after his election, was moved to plan an expedition for the defense of the Eastern Empire, which he justly regarded as the bulwark of Europe against Islam. He issued a general appeal to the princes of Europe for help and personal service. He even proposed to accompany the relieving force. But Gregory, though not without imagination, lacked the power of firing popular enthusiasm, and aroused mistrust by the admission that he intended using the crusade in the first instance against the Normans of Lower Italy. Few volunteers were forthcoming, and his own energies were diverted to another channel by the outbreak of the War of Investitures. It was left for Urban II to revive Gregory's project in another and more popular form, at a moment when Henry IV seemed a beaten and a broken man, and the unity of the Seljuk power had been shattered by the death of Malik Shah. In reality, the danger from the Turks was then a thing of the past. But even if Urban was correctly informed of their weakness, it needed little knowledge of history to warn him that one aggressive movement of Islam only died away to be succeeded by another. Like Gregory, he desired to strengthen the Eastern Empire, but his plan was new: to found a Latin state in Palestine for the defense of Jerusalem and the southeast Mediterranean. As with the First Crusade, so with the Second and the Third. Each was a response to new victories of Mohammedan princes. The Second Crusade, 1147, was proclaimed in consequence of the fall of Edessa, the northeast outpost of the Latin kingdom. The Third, 1189, was designed to recover Jerusalem and to cripple the Sultanate of Egypt, which under Saladin seemed on the eve of absorbing not only Syria, but also Asia Minor and the Euphrates Valley. The signal failure of an expedition for which armies were raised by the emperor, the kings of France and England, and many lesser princes, left the power of Egypt an object of almost superstitious awe. The Fifth Crusade, 1217, and the Seventh, 1248, expended their best energies in fruitless and disastrous descents on the Nile Delta. To this view of the Crusades, as a business of high political importance, the best of the laymen who led the Christian armies were sincerely attached. Many others, equally sincere but governed more by sentiment than reason, were moved by the desire to see the holy places and secure them as the common property of Christendom. But the most pertinacious and successful of the commanders went eastward, as their kinsmen went across the Elbe or the Alps or the Pyrenees, to carve out for themselves new principalities at the expense of Byzantine or Saracen. It did not matter which. Naturally, the sovereign princes who took the cross do not fall into this category. For them, an expedition might be either an adventure or the grudging fulfillment of a penance, or a bid for the esteem of their subjects. But it was often a conscious sacrifice of self-interest and national interests to a higher duty. However low their motives, it would not have paid them to turn aside from the task enjoined upon them by European opinion. Even Frederick II, the least Christian of crusaders, who only accomplished his vow to put the Pope, his adversary, in the wrong, fulfilled his undertaking to the letter before he ventured to return. But a crusade controlled by men of lower rank tended to be a joint stock company of freebooters. For every crusade the Pope was, to a certain point, responsible. He issued the appeal, he tuned the pulpits, he invited contributions from the laity and exacted them from the national churches. He provided for the enforcement by ecclesiastical censures of all crusading vows. In the choice of leaders, and in the preliminary councils of war, he had a claim to be consulted. One or more of his legates normally accompanied the armies, but if the generals chose to ignore his suggestions and to override his representatives, after the march had once begun, he was powerless. Usually, it is true, his views would appeal to the rank and file, exempt as they were from the temptations presented to their leaders. But the common soldiers could only leave the host if they had the means of paying for themselves the expenses of the homeward journey. Often they protested against the uses to which their arms were put, but very seldom were they able to enforce a change of policy. Godfrey of Bouillon and his fellow leaders, when they passed through Constantinople, 1097, did homage to the emperor, Alexius, for any lands that they might conquer. The transaction may not have been voluntary. This homage was the price demanded for a safe conduct through the Greek dominions. But later events proved that the chief crusaders were resolved not to hold their conquests as fiefs from the Holy See, for which they were nominally fighting. As they drew near to the Holy Land, it became clear that the rescue of the Holy Sepulchre was a subordinate consideration with them. At Tarsus and at Antioch, there were fierce disputes between rival claimants to the conquered territories. Baldwin separated from the main army to found a seigneury for himself at Edessa. Bohemund remained behind when Antioch was once assigned to him, for fear that any rival should rob him of his prize. Raymond of Toulouse turned aside to reduce Tripoli, and was with the greatest difficulty constrained to continue the march. The final result of a war in which the loss of men must be reckoned by tens of thousands was the establishment of the 4 states of Jerusalem, Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli. To extend the boundaries of these colonies and to consolidate them under the suzerainty of the Crown of Jerusalem was the work of their rulers for the next 80 years. These princes were esteemed as champions of the cross. To assist them in the defense of their territories, the military orders of the temple and the hospital were founded under the sanction of the church. Apart from the great relieving expeditions, such as those of 1101 and 1147 and 1189, annual fleets of soldier pilgrims arrived to take part in the operations of the year. But there is little to show that either the kings of Jerusalem or their great vassals ever justified their position by pursuing an unselfish policy. That the dominions which they ruled were imperfectly colonized cannot be made a reproach against them. Only for knights and merchants had the Holy Land any attractions. But the inevitable weakness of the Frankish states was aggravated by their feuds and reciprocal ill faith. More than 100 years elapsed before another expedition of this kind started for the East. The Second Crusade, inspired by Saint Bernard, acting as the half-reluctant spokesman of the Holy See, was ill-organized, ill-directed, and so disastrous a failure that it was followed by a perceptible reaction against the idealistic policy of which it was the outcome. It revealed to Europe the inefficiency of forces raised with more regard to the pious motives than to the efficiency of the recruits, and laid bare the calculating selfishness of the Latin principalities. But the principal leaders, Louis VII, of France and the Emperor Conrad II, could not be charged with insincerity. They made gross mistakes, but were faithful to the purpose with which they set out. Similarly, in the Third Crusade, though part of the failure can be directly attributed to the national jealousies of the various contingents, and to the quarrels of Richard III with the more important of his colleagues, the recovery of Jerusalem remained from first to last the dominant object of the army. There were cases of petulance, of unnecessary meddling in the squalid disputes of the Latin settlers, of readiness to depart on the first honourable excuse, but there was no disposition to make the pilgrimage a commercial undertaking. It was otherwise in 1203, when the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade set out from Venice, leaving behind them the papal legate and openly defying the injunctions of Innocent III, whose appeal to Christendom was nominally the warrant for their venture. No king sailed with them. From the first, the movement had been in the hands of turbulent feudatories, inspired by chivalry rather than religion. Their leader, Boniface of Montferrat, the patron of all the troubadours and knights-errant of the south, was a sworn friend of the Pope's worst enemy, Philip of Swabia, the brother and successor of the Emperor Henry VI. Boniface had been elected to the command without the sanction of the Pope, and from an early date was in league with Philip to turn the crusade against Constantinople. This plan was for a time concealed from the army, in which a majority of the common soldiers were bent upon recovering the Holy Sepulchre. But the nobles, with whom lay the last word, were ready for whatever adventure the course of events might suggest. Their original hope was to conquer Egypt, an infinitely more tempting prey than Palestine, where the chief fruits of any success would be claimed by the remnants of the standing garrison. To obtain ships from Venice, they undertook on her behalf the siege of Zara. Their first feat of arms was the conquest of a Christian city, the only offence of which was that it disputed the Venetian supremacy in the Adriatic. At Zara, they were invited by Philip's envoys to attack Constantinople, to overthrow the Emperor Alexius III, and to substitute for him another Alexius, son of the deposed Isaac Angelus, and brother-in-law to Philip. The proposal received enthusiastic support from the Venetians, whose great commercial interests in the Greek capital had been often assailed by the fanaticism of the city populace. The Venetians held the key of the situation, since, if they withdrew their transports, the army could neither go forward nor return in safety, and the nobles, who needed little persuasion, were able to convince the more earnest pilgrims that Philip's offer must of necessity be accepted. Though Alexius III was on friendly terms with the Pope, and had been expected to assist the crusade. To palliate the flagrant treachery, a promise was exacted from the pretender that, when installed as emperor, he would help in the conquest of Egypt with men, money, and supplies. On July 17, 1203, the army entered Constantinople after a short siege. Alexius III escaped by flight, and Alexius IV was installed in his place. Still, the Crusaders lingered in a city, the outward splendor of which appealed irresistibly to their imagination and their avarice. The winter, they said, was approaching, and their candidate far from secure upon the throne. They would wait for the spring. Before that date, and in spite of their countenance, he had fallen before a nationalist rebellion, January 1204, and the army hailed the opportunity of reuniting the Greek Church to Rome and partitioning the Greek Empire among themselves. An agreement was made with the indispensable Venetians for the election of a Latin emperor, to be endowed with 1/4 of the provinces. The booty of Constantinople and the remaining lands of the empire were to be divided equally between the Venetians and the remaining leaders. For the second time, Constantinople was carried by storm. A fire destroyed a large part of the city, and the Crusaders completed the devastation by 3 days of indiscriminate plunder and massacre. Neither the treasures of the churches nor the priceless monuments and statues of the public places were spared. The sum total of the booty was thought to be equal to all the wealth of Western Europe, but when it came to the official division, all that the knights obtained was 20 marks apiece. 10 were the portion of a priest, and 5 of a foot soldier. The other articles of the treaty, which had been referred for form's sake to the Pope, were executed without awaiting his reply. The Venetian candidate, Count Baldwin of Flanders, was elected to the empire and received the Asiatic provinces. Boniface of Montferrat obtained, as a solatium, the kingdom of Thessalonica, embracing roughly the modern provinces of Thessaly and Macedonia. His followers were allowed to establish themselves by degrees in central Greece and the Morea. The Venetians took the islands of the Ionian Sea, the Cyclades, and Aegina and Negropont, the provinces of Albania, Acarnania, and Aetolia, the city of Adrianople with the adjacent territories, and other possessions of less note. The Pope, compelled to recognize accomplished facts, merely demanded 3 concessions: that the Latin faith should be established as the official religion of the empire, that the possessions of the Greek Church should be handed over to the Latin clergy, and that the Crusaders should continue their pilgrimage at the end of a year. Only the first of these points was conceded. The crusade of Innocent III ended, like that of Urban II, in the creation of a string of feudal states and commercial factories. But in 1204 there was hardly the attempt to justify what had been done in the name of religion. The Venetians behaved, from first to last, as commercial buccaneers. A fickle and frivolous ambition, rather than calculating villainy, characterized their high-born associates. Plainly, these were the only materials available for a crusade. The collapse of the crusading. A few romantic careers illuminate the monotonously sordid annals of the Latin Empire, threatened from within by the feuds of the rival baronial houses, from without by the Bulgarians, the Greek despots of Epirus, and the Greek emperors of Nicaea. Henry of Flanders, the second Latin emperor, 1205 to 1216, the one constructive statesman produced by the Crusade. William of Champlitte, who overran the Morea with but 100 knights, was hailed by the oppressed Greeks as a liberator and founded the Principality of Achaia, 1205-1209, only to lose it through the treachery of a lieutenant. Niccolo Acciajuoli, 1365, the Florentine banker, who rose to be Lord of Corinth, Count of Malta, and administrator of Achaia. These were men who on a greater stage might have achieved durable renown. But the subject Greeks were not to be Latinized by a handful of energetic seigneurs and merchants. One by one, as opportunities occurred, the provinces of the Latin Empire deserted to the allegiance of Nicaea. Adrianople and Thessalonica were lost in 1222, the Asiatic territories by 1228. In 1261, Michael Palaeologus recovered Constantinople, which was to remain the possession of his family until the capture by the Turks, 1453. In Greece and the islands, the colonists maintained a foothold long after the fall of the Latin Empire. But the last of the Frankish dukes of Athens fell, with all his chivalry, fighting against the Catalan Company, 1311, a horde of freebooters half-Christian and half-Turkish in its composition. Achaia, after years of ignominious subjection to the Angevins of Naples, was similarly conquered by the Company of Navarre, 1380. In a maimed condition, the two states survived these calamities, but the Greeks and the Venetians were enabled to absorb the richest parts of the peninsula. The last traces of Frankish blood and institutions were swept away by the Turkish conquerors of the 15th century. Before these grim invaders, the Venetians and the Knights of St. John, the last representatives of Western power, slowly evacuated the Eastern Mediterranean. The story of this brilliant and ephemeral episode in the expansion of Europe is closed by the Venetian peace of 1479 with the Sultan, and by the fall of Rhodes, the stronghold of the Knights, before the Turkish arms, 1522. But in Malta, down to the commencement of the 19th century, might be seen the strange and scandalous spectacle of a crusading order, emancipated from the old vows and obligations, yet still allowed to exercise a medieval tyranny in memory of the services which their remote predecessors had rendered to the cross. The other orders had vanished, not less ignominiously, at earlier dates. The Templars, who had evacuated Syria to live on their European estates and ply the trade of bankers, were proscribed on charges of heresy by Pope Clement V for 1312 to gratify the brutal greed of a French king. The Teutonic Knights, better counselled by their Grand Master, Hermann of Salza, 1210-1239, looked about for a new field of conquest. They found it on the lower Vistula, where they settled with the countenance of the Pope, the Emperor, and the King of Poland to reduce the heathen Slavs. But, embroiled with their Polish protector by their territorial ambitions, they were reduced, after 1466, to narrow boundaries in East Prussia, and hardly a voice was raised in their favour when the last Grand Master, a Hohenzollern by birth, became a Protestant and bequeathed the lands of the order to his own family, 1525. From the adventures of the Frankish colonists, we turn with relief to notice the last expiring flashes of enthusiasm in the armies equipped for their relief. The Germans and Hungarians of the Fifth Crusade, 1217, showed more sincerity than worldly wisdom in delegating the chief command to a papal legate, and in following to the bitter end his reckless plan of campaign. Inspired with the hope of expelling Islam from the Eastern Mediterranean, they would neither be content with Damietta, which they conquered, nor with the Holy Land, which was offered in exchange by the Sultan of Egypt. They would have all or nothing, and they lost even Damietta. In the end, their discomfiture by the Nile floods, which they had forgotten to take into their reckoning, was a tragicomic ending to a campaign in which greed and discord had been expiated by extraordinary daring. St. Louis, in his crusades of 1248 and 1270, flew in the face of common prudence and was thought a pious fool, even by the barons who were too loyal to disobey his call. But it is such follies that make history something better than a Newgate calendar of the crimes of common sense. He was no general. His attack on Egypt was foredoomed to failure and was made more disastrous by neglect of ordinary precautions. That on Tunis, undertaken in the heat of an African summer, ended, as might have been expected, in his own death and the decimation of his followers by disease. Even as an example, these expeditions were all but fruitless. Yet, when the worst has been said of the Crusades and those who led them, there are moments in the quixotic career of St. Louis which haunt the fancy and compel our admiration. His, bearing when, a captive of the Egyptian Sultan, he refused, even under threats of torture, to barter a single Christian fortress for his freedom. His lonely watch in Palestine, when for 3 years he patiently awaited the reinforcements that were never sent. His deathbed, when he prayed for strength to despise good fortune and not to fear adversity. Ideals may fade, but the memories of those who realize them are the world's abiding possession. If we ask what results of a more tangible sort remained from the Crusades, when the service of the Holy Sepulchre had become a legend and the name of crusade a byword for whatever enterprises are most impractical and visionary, the answer must be that they affected Europe chiefly in a negative sense and through indirect channels. They helped to discredit the conception of the church militant. They relieved Europe of a surplus population of feudal adventurers, and they accelerated the impoverishment of those other feudal families, which took an occasional part in the Holy War. It has never been proved that they led to wholesale emancipation of serfs or wholesale enfranchisement of towns, though it is true that all such expeditions meant an increased demand for ready money. To Western civilization, they contributed very little, the truth being that there was little to be learned from the Mohammedans in Syria. It is through Palermo and Toledo, where Christianity and Islam met and mixed in peaceful intercourse, that the knowledge of Arab science and philosophy filtered into Europe. The Fourth Crusade was an exception to the general rule. It is no accident that Venetian art and architecture developed rapidly when the Republic was brought into close and friendly relations with Constantinople. Through these relations, and through studying the masterpieces brought home by the Crusaders, Venetian artists recovered the antique feeling for pure form and founded a school which was classical in spirit, Christian only in external and unessential features. The learning and literature which the Eastern Empire inherited from Rome and Athens had no attraction for Venetian merchant princes. But north of the Alps, and especially at Paris, the 13th century saw an increasing interest in the Greek language and in Greek books, so far as they were useful to theologians or scholastic disputants. Politically, the Fourth Crusade is memorable for its effect upon the Italian balance of power. It gave Venice an advantage over her commercial rivals, Pisa and Genoa, which she never lost. It gave her also a unique position as an intermediary between East and West, and it placed her at the head of an empire comparable to those of Athens and of Carthage, the great sea powers of antiquity. But the nation-states of Northern Europe, who had borne the burden and heat of the Crusades, were less affected by them, politically or otherwise, than were the city-states of Italy. Scattered broadcast over the territory of every medieval state are towns endowed with special privileges and ruled by special magistrates. Some of these towns, particularly in Italy, southern France and the Rhineland, stand on the sites and even within the walls of ancient municipia, those miniature homes which the statecraft of the empire had created as seats of government and schools of culture. But even in Italy, the medieval town is indebted to classical antiquity for nothing more than mouldering walls and aqueducts and amphitheatres and churches. The barbarians had ignored the institutions of the municipium, though it often served them as a fortress or a royal residence or a centre of administration. The citizens were degraded to the level of serfs. They became the property of a king, a bishop, or a count, and were governed by a bailiff presiding over a seigneurial court. Only at the close of the Dark Ages, with the development of handicrafts and a commercial class, was it found necessary to distinguish between the town and the manorial village. And to a much later time, the small town preserved the characteristics of an agricultural society. Many a burgess supplemented the profits of a trade by tilling acres in the common fields and grazing cattle on the common pastures. Pigs and poultry scavenged in the streets. The farmyard was a usual adjunct of the burgage tenement. Whether small or great, the town was a phenomenon sufficiently unfamiliar to vex the soul of lawyers reared upon Teutonic custom. They recognized that they were dealing with a new form of community, but they were not prepared to define it or to generalize about it. They preferred to treat each town as sui generis, an awkward anomaly, a privileged abuse. Indeed, definition was no easy matter, for medieval towns differed infinitely in size, in government, and in the ingredients of their population. In one respect, they are all alike. The most energetic and influential, though not necessarily the greater number of the inhabitants, are artisans or traders. But side by side with the industrial colony stand older interests, which often struggle hard against the ascendancy of commerce. In the town or near it, there may be an abbey or a castle, or a cathedral or a royal palace, to which the very existence of the burgess community is due. The townsmen, profiting by the custom and the protection of the great, have grown rich and independent. They have bought privileges or have usurped them. But they have still to reckon with the servants, the retainers, and the other partisans of a superior always on the watch to recover his lost rights of property and jurisdiction. The forces of the common enemy are permanently encamped within the walls. Again, if the town lies on a frontier or a newly conquered country, it will be as much a fortress as a mart. A number of the residents will be knights or men-at-arms who hold their lands by the tenure of defending the town, and these burgesses will be naturally indifferent to the interests of the traders. Finally, in the Mediterranean lands, with their long tradition of urban society, we find the nobles of the neighborhood resorting to the town, building townhouses, and frequently caballing among themselves to obtain control of the town's government. Often a long time elapses before the class which conceived the idea of municipal liberty is able to get the better of these hostile forces. And still more often, the hardly won privileges are wrested from those for whom they were intended, are cancelled, or are made the monopoly of an oligarchic ring. Still, the aims of the medieval burgess are more uniform, from one place to another, and from one generation to another, than we might anticipate in ages when information travelled slowly, and when the relations of every town to its lord were settled by a separate treaty. In modern Europe, the town is an administrative district of the state and is organized upon a standard pattern. In medieval Europe, the town charter was frequently a compromise with the caprices and the interests of a petty seigneur, and even kings were inclined to deal with the towns which stood upon the royal domain in a spirit of the frankest opportunism. Moreover, the inclination of all lords was to meddle with their burgesses no further than seemed necessary to ensure the full and punctual discharge of all services and pecuniary dues. So long as these were guaranteed, the internal affairs of the town might be left for the residents to settle as seemed good to them. But, as to the main conditions of the compact, each of the contracting parties holds clear-cut and unwavering views. The lords are agreed that privileges of trade and tenure may safely be granted if the chief magistrates are nominated by and accountable to themselves. The townsfolk, on the other hand, assume that promises of free tenure and free trade will be worth nothing unless accompanied by the permission to elect all magistrates and councils. Sometimes the victory rests with the lord and sometimes with the burgesses. Accordingly, there are two kinds of chartered town. The larger class includes communities enjoying certain privileges under the rule of seigneurial functionaries. A smaller class consists of those which are not only privileged, but free, that is, self-governing bodies corporate. The distinction between the two classes is not precise enough to satisfy a modern lawyer. Often, a free town is obliged to allow the lords some voice in the appointment of magistrates. While the humblest body of traders may enjoy the right of doing justice in a market court without the interference of a bailiff, the one class shades off into the other, if only for the reason that freedom is usually won by a gradual process of bargaining or encroachment on the part of towns which are already privileged. The higher type is simply a later stage in the natural course of municipal development. If we analyze the privileges of those towns which remain in leading strings, the first in order of time and of importance is the town peace, which only the king or his delegate can grant. Invested with this peace, the town becomes, like a royal palace or the shrine of a saint, a sanctuary protected by special pains and penalties. The burgess stands to the king in the same relation as the widow and the orphan. To do him wrong is an outrage against the royal majesty. Next comes the right of trade. The burgesses are allowed to commute their servile dues and obligations for a fixed money rent, that they may be at liberty for pursuits more lucrative than agriculture. They also receive a license to hold a weekly market, and possibly a yearly fair as well. It is agreed that all disputes of traders which arise in fair or market shall be decided according to the law of merchants, the general usage of the commercial world, and a safe conduct is granted to all strangers who resort to either gathering for lawful purposes. At first, the tolls of the fair and market are collected by the lord, and the law merchant is administered in the court of his bailiff. Often, however, He ends by leasing both the tolls and the commercial jurisdiction to the townsmen. When they are permitted, as in Flanders and in England, to form a merchant guild, it is with this body that such bargains are concluded, and the guild usually purchases from the lord a quantity of other privileges, the monopoly of certain staple industries in the town and neighbourhood, rights of preemption over all imported wares, and the power of making bylaws to regulate wages, prices, the hours of labour, and the quality of manufactured goods. Where the lord is a sovereign prince, he is often induced to make concessions of a wider scope: freedom from inland tolls and from customs at the seaports, the right of making reprisals upon native and foreign enemies who rob the merchants or infringe the privileges of the town, immunity in civil suits from every jurisdiction but that of the town court. It would be easy to multiply examples of this type of town, but we can only mention here a few whose history and customs are particularly instructive. One of the oldest is Saint-Riquier in Ponthieu, a notable instance of an industrial community dating from Carolingian times and fostered by the policy of a great religious house. The second half of the 11th century is remarkable for the speculative acumen displayed by lay and secular lords in fostering the development of new commercial centres. The Norman bourg of Breteuil, founded in 1060 by a seneschal of William the Conqueror, deserves special consideration as a model extensively imitated in England, Wales, and Ireland. The Swabian towns of Allensbach and Radolfzell, chartered by the great Abbey of Reichenau a few years later, are monuments of German seigneurial enterprise. Lauris-en-Gâtinais, a town on the domain of the French monarchy, received from Louis VI a set of privileges which became the standard for the numerous villes de bourgeoisie founded under the immediate sway of the Capetian dynasty. But the charters, thankfully accepted by new colonies or embryonic market centres, were insufficient to satisfy the aspirations of older and greater cities. At the very time when far-sighted seigneurs are scattering commercial privileges broadcast, there begins among the urban classes of North France, of Flanders, and of some Italian provinces, an agitation for more extensive rights, for free municipal constitutions of our second type. In these regions, the popular cry is commune, novum ac pessimum nomen, and it is blended with complaints of feudal tyranny, which often develop, since the seigneur of the town is commonly a bishop or an abbot, into complaints against the church. The commune is a sworn confederacy, conjuratio, which bears some resemblance both to the fraternities established for the enforcement of the truce of God, Supra, Pena 103, and to the merchant guilds. But it has also new and striking features. It is formed in defiance of authority, and for the purpose of seizing rights which are legally vested in the seigneur or the crown. It is hostile to the ruling classes of society, and the object of the members is to establish a republican form of government within their city. They are largely merchants or artisans, but they concern themselves with wider interests than those of trade, and often insist that no man, of whatever avocation, shall remain in the city unless he joins the commune. We should be glad to know more of the bold spirits who directed the communal movement in this early stage. They startled contemporaries by their radicalism, and their conduct gives the lie to our preconceived idea that a townsman is a man of peace. These medieval burgesses were accustomed to defend their rights by force. There is nothing abnormal in the rule of the merchant guild of Valenciennes that the guild brethren should always bring their weapons with them to the market and should ride in armed companies to distant fairs. The Milanese and the men of Ghent are typical in their greed for empire, in their readiness to strike a blow for their own profit whenever war is in the land. If the seigneurs of such cities gave cause for dissatisfaction, they found that they had brought a hornet's nest about their ears. In the struggle for liberties, the popular party displayed a high courage, which rose superior to defeat, though in the hour of triumph it was too often sullied by ferocious acts of vengeance. They threw themselves with intelligence and energy into the feuds of other interests and classes, backing the church against the state against the baronage, or the weaker against the stronger of two rival lords. The policy of the towns was often double-faced, material and separatist, but it also embodied ideals of justice, and of citizenship, which were destined to prevail in the struggle for existence and to produce a wholesome reformation in the structure of society. The communal program was not realized in a day. The struggle for free governments, which began in the 11th century, was continued into the 13th and 14th. And the forces of the movement were already exhausted in North France and Italy before it reached a head in South France or in Germany. Naturally, in a conflict waged over so wide an area for several hundred years, the watchwords were often modified, and many different patterns of town government were devised. In its later stages, the movement was more peaceful, and the purse was often found a better argument than the sword. The communal parties ceased to be democratic, though they never ceased to be republican, and power was practically, if not formally, monopolized by a municipal patriciate. The mass meeting of the burgesses, all-powerful in the days when the commune was an organized rebellion, gradually became insignificant in the older communes, and in many of the late foundations was never recognized at all, its powers being distributed among the craft guilds meeting in their separate assemblies. Concurrent with this diminution in the importance of the ordinary burgess, there is a tendency to restrict the franchise by demanding higher and higher qualifications from the candidates. The commune, in fact, sinks almost to the level of a trades union or a benefit society, and membership is valued chiefly as a title to exclusive rights of trade and poor relief. The political aspect of the institution is almost forgotten in countries where the power of the state gains ground upon the centrifugal forces of society, and in those communes which preserve the dignity of states, an internecine conflict between the rich and poor, the rulers and the ruled, usually becomes the main feature of domestic politics. In spite of these changes in principles and spirit, the organs of communal government are almost everywhere the same. The executive power is vested in a board or committee called in Italy the consuls, in France the échevins, jurati or syndics, in Germany the rath, council. Commonly this board has a president, known in France and England as the mayor, in Germany as the Bürgermeister, who represents the body corporate in all negotiations with the seigneur or the crown or other communes. One or more councils, sapientes, pairs, etc., are often found assisting the executive with their advice. And in the older type of commune, the mass meeting plays a conspicuous part, not only electing magistrates and councils, but also voting taxes, auditing the accounts of expenditure, and deciding on all questions of exceptional importance. Where the General Assembly is non-existent or moribund, offices are filled either by co-optation or by elections in the assemblies of the craft guilds, or are even allowed to descend by hereditary right. As the popular control over the executive declines, jealousy of the executive leads to some disastrous changes, to the multiplication of offices, to the shortening of terms of office, to the creation of innumerable checks and balances, to the organization of this or that powerful interest or party as a state within the state. But the morbid pathology of the communes in their last stage of decline is a subject with which we need not here concern ourselves. These intricate expedients, which are best exemplified in the constitution of 14th century Florence, weakened the government, but could not make it more impartial or more tolerant. By the end of the Middle Ages, the ordinary burgess was prepared to hail the advent of a royal bailiff or a self-constituted despot as the only cure for the inveterate disorders incident to freedom. It is refreshing to turn back from the period of disillusionment to that of sanguine expectations, and to study the commune in the period of infancy and growth, when no other refuge from anarchy and oppression was open to the industrial classes, and when emancipated serfs were still intoxicated with the dream of liberty. Curiously enough, the communal revolution began most quietly in the land where it was ultimately responsible for the fiercest conflicts. The cities of North Italy gained their first installments of freedom at different periods in the 11th century, by bargains or by usurpations of which few records have come down to us. At Pisa, we hear of an agreement between the bishop and the citizens, 1080-1085, under which the latter are permitted to form a peace association, to hold mass meetings, and to elect consuls who shall cooperate with the bishop in the government. At Genoa, on the other hand, the commune appears, in 1122, after several earlier conjuraciones have been successfully resisted and dispersed. Probably the case of Pisa is more typical than that of Genoa, since we usually hear of a commune for the first time when it is already a fully developed institution. In most of the North Italian cities, it was at the expense of a bishop that the commune was established. Legally, the change meant the transference from the bishop or another seigneur to the town of powers derived by delegation from the emperor, and it took place in the course of the investitures contest, when the bishops, conscious of simony and other offences which made their position insecure, were more concerned to dissuade their citizens from siding with the party of ecclesiastical reform than to fulfill their duties as officials of the empire. The emperors themselves, hard-pressed in the struggle with the papacy and eager to purchase support at any price, contributed to the success of the communal movement by the charters which they bestowed on some important cities. In northern France, the situation was less favourable to the towns. Often, indeed, it suited the policy of the capets to weaken an overmighty subject by protecting his rebellious serfs. But the bishops and the lay seigneurs offered a pertinacious opposition to all demands for enfranchisement. The king was a timid and vacillating ally, always inclined to desert the cause of the townsfolk for a bribe, always in fear that the movement might spread to his domain. Whatever his sympathies, he could do little when it came to blows, but stand aside and watch the conflict. Two examples will serve to illustrate the general features of these feuds between municipalities and lords. Bois. In 1070, the men of Le Mans were driven to rebellion by the lawlessness of the local baronage and by the oppressions of the governor whom an absentee count had put over them. They formed a commune and compelled the more timid of their enemies to swear that they would recognize it. Others they caught and hanged or blinded, and they made systematic war against the castles of the neighbourhood, which they took one by one and burned to the ground. And this, says the outraged chronicler, in Lent, and even on Good Friday. The citizens themselves thought no season too sacred for such a crusade against anarchy. Once, when their militia went out to attack a castle, the bishop and his clergy were induced to lead the vanguard, bearing crosses and consecrated banners. But after a time, the fortune of war turned against the commune. The militia were routed, and the count's lieutenant recovered the castle which dominated Le Mans. The citizens offered their allegiance to the Count of Anjou if he would deliver them. He came to the rescue, the governor fled, the castle was surrendered by the garrison and at once demolished. But before the citizens had settled their future relations with Anjou, an English army appeared, led by William the Conqueror, their lawful suzerain. The Angevins effaced themselves. The citizens, making a virtue of necessity, opened their gates to the king, and since he would only confirm their ancient liberties, the existence of the commune was abruptly terminated, 1073. 2. At Laon in the next generation, there was a wilder and more calamitous rising against the misrule of the bishop. His name was Waldric. He had been Chancellor to Henry I of England and was elected by the chapter of Laon, 1106, because of the great wealth which he had accumulated, none too honestly, in the course of his short official career. Much of his private fortune was expended in procuring the Pope's approval of his very irregular election. The remainder was soon squandered in extravagant and riotous living, and the bishop then began to exploit his seigneurial rights in Laon. His extortions were the more resented since he kept no order. The environs of the city swarmed with brigands and footpads, and kidnappers were allowed to work their will inside the city. At length, the burgesses seized an opportunity, when the bishop was away in England, to set up a commune. On his return, he was obliged to accept the situation and to recognize the commune in return for a substantial payment. But he further recouped himself by debasing the local currency till it was practically worthless, and he gratified his spite against the citizens by an atrocious crime. Professing to have discovered a conspiracy against his life, he arrested the mayor and caused the unhappy man to be blinded by a black slave, whom he employed as his bodyguard and executioner. The friends of the mayor complained to the Pope, but the bishop got before them with his own version of the story, and by the help of bribery secured an honourable acquittal. By the same arguments, he induced the king to quash the charter of the commune, and then seemed master of the situation. But the men of Leon conspired to kill him as he was going in state to the cathedral. He was with difficulty rescued by his knights and found it necessary to garrison the episcopal palace with villains from his country estates. Arrogant as ever, he boasted of his power and the satisfaction that he would exact. The time was coming, he said, when his black slave should pull the noses of the most respected citizens, and the fellows would not dare to grunt. He was soon undeceived. The mob of Leon stormed the palace and massacred the defenders. They found the bishop in the cellars, disguised as a peasant and hiding in an empty cask. They dragged him forth by the hair of his head and hacked him to pieces in the street. 1112. When a calmer mood returned, the citizens were appalled at the prospect of the king's indignation. Those who were conscious of guilt fled from the city, which was left half deserted. The barons and the serfs of the surrounding country swooped. Like vultures upon Laon, pillaged the empty houses and fought with one another for the spoil. For the next 16 years, the remnant of the citizens lived a miserable existence as the mere serfs of Waldric's successors. In 1128, the king permitted them to associate under a mayor for the better maintenance of the public peace. But they were denied the title of a commune and continued to be subject to the jurisdiction of the bishop. These dramas of oppression and retaliation, though characteristic in the sense that they reveal the worst faults and the best excuses of the communal movement, were happily exceptional in northern France, not because oppression was rare, but because rebellions defeated their own object. No seigneurial concessions were worth the parchment on which they were inscribed, without a confirmation from the king. And it was not the king's interest to condone sacrilege or overt treason against a feudal lord. Hence the founders of a North French commune preferred to keep their agitation within the bounds of law. They invoked the king's help, and he, for an adequate consideration, destroyed seigneurial rights by a few strokes of the pen, which he did the more readily since his lawyers had formulated the doctrine that communes were tenants of the crown, liable to military service and to taxation at the royal pleasure. From the close of the 12th century, there was a firm alliance between the Third Estate and the French monarchy. On the whole, it was more advantageous to the king than to the communes. Under St. Louis and his successors, when the power of the feudatories was broken, the commune presented itself as an obstacle in the path of central government. On one pretext or another, here because of faction fights, and there for mismanagement of the communal finances, the cities lost their charters and passed under the rule of royal commissioners. It was a poor compensation that the Third Estate obtained the right of sending delegates to the States General of the kingdom. Representation brought new liabilities without corresponding rights. The Third Estate, holding jealously aloof from the estates of the nobles and the clergy, was powerless against a determined sovereign. The French Commune, in fact, was a special expedient for the cure of a transitory evil. Republican institutions were in France an exotic growth, inconsistent with national traditions, and only welcome to classes which had neither the political intelligence nor the material resources to maintain their own ideals in the face of persistent opposition. It is significant that the charters of the French communes were frequently cancelled with the approval of the citizen assemblies. The situation was different in Flanders and North Italy, where the city was the natural unit of society, and the burgher class, enriched by foreign trade, were strong enough to negotiate on equal terms with their nominal superiors. Cities such as Ghent and Milan were shielded from contact with the great monarchies until the habit of self-government was firmly rooted in the citizens. When at last they were confronted with the absolutist claims of the Capets or the Hohenstaufen, these cities did not shrink from a direct appeal to arms, and the wars which they waged for independence are not the least interesting chapter of medieval history. Flanders was vexed by a problem of overpopulation, for which neither the continuous exodus of emigrants nor the systematic reclaiming of marshlands offered a permanent solution. At an early date, her middle classes discovered the grand principle of modern industry, that by manufacturing for foreign markets, the production of wealth can be accelerated to an indefinite degree, and the most prolific communities maintained, in affluence upon a sterile or restricted territory. The superfluous labour of the Flemish countryside flocked into towns at the bidding of Flemish capital, and found remunerative employment in the weaving trade. From 1127 onwards, these towns were bargaining with the counts of Flanders for emancipation. Bruges, Ypres, Lille and Ghent were only the most successful among 40 thriving communities, which, at the close of the 12th century, enjoyed a large measure of self-government, but found their liberties threatened by the King of France. To meet the danger, the Flemish communes embarked on the stormy sea of politics. At first, they fought the king in the name of the count and made their first appearance as a military power on the disastrous field of Bouvines, 1214, which cost Count Ferrand his liberty and the communes the flower of their militia. The successors of Ferrand sank deeper and deeper into dependence on the Capets, until the communes were forced in self-defense to assume the leading role. At Courtrai, in 1302, they turned the tables on the crown and took an ample vengeance for Bouvines by a terrible slaughter of French knights and men-at-arms, demonstrating to a startled Europe that feudal tactics were obsolete and that pikemen on foot were a match for the best mailed cavalry. Cheated by a treacherous count of the due fruits of their victory, the Flemish communes nursed their resentment and waited for new opportunities, while consoling themselves with savage persecution of the nobles, the clergy, and all others whom they suspected of French sympathies. The ambition of Edward III came at length to their assistance. Under the leadership of Jacques van Artevelde, a merchant prince and demagogue of Ghent, they signed a treaty with the English king for the invasion and conquest of France, 1339. It was a brief and ill-starred alliance, ruinous to Flemish trade, and abruptly ended by the fall of Artevelde, whom his fellow citizens tore limb from limb under the impression that he was aiming at a tyranny, 1345. But events soon justified the bold proposals of the fallen statesman. In 1369, the heiress of the county was given to a French prince of the blood. The French party in Flanders reared their heads. Bruges, to the alarm and fury of all patriots, joined the foreign cause from jealousy of Ghent. War broke out between the two great rivals, and the men of Ghent, commanded by Philip, the son of Jacques van Artevelde, gained the upper hand. Victorious in a pitched battle, they pursued the beaten army into Bruges, massacred the partisans of France, and put the city to the sack. No other commune dared to imitate the policy of Bruges, or to dispute the supremacy of Ghent in Flanders. The younger Artevelde, like his father before him, stood out for a brief moment as the dictator of a league of free republics. But the generals of France had profited by their hard experience in the wars with England. At Rosbecker, 1382, the men of Ghent, charging the French cavalry like wild boars, found themselves outflanked and were crushed by the weight of superior science and numbers. They fought with the fury of despair, neither expecting nor receiving quarter. More than 20,000 of the citizens fell in the battle and were left, by the king's order, unburied on the field. The corpse of Artevelde, who had been suffocated in the press, was hanged on a gibbet for a warning to all demagogues. With him died the daydream of an independent Flanders. Though her cities remained prosperous, they were destined to be successively the subjects of the Burgundian, the Spaniard, and the Austrian. It was only in 1831 that Flanders at length became a province in a kingdom based on the Walloon nationality. The Italian communes present, in their sharp vicissitudes of fortune, a spectacle not less dramatic and infinitely more momentous for the general history of Europe. In Italy, as in Flanders, the fair ideal of civic freedom was blurred and defaced by party feuds and personal ambitions, by the fickleness and passion of the mob, by the lust of conquest and the fratricidal jealousies of neighbouring republics. Yet to the influence of this ideal, we must attribute both the solidarity of the Italian city-state and the wealth of individual genius which it fostered. The Italian Renaissance was little more than the harvest time of medieval Italy, the glorious evening of a day which had dawned with the Fourth Crusade and had reached high noon in the lifetimes of Dante and Giotto. In the 15th century, the aptitudes which had ripened in the intense and crowded life of turbulent republics were concentrated upon art and letters. The leisure and the security which the specialist demands were bought by renouncing the utopian visions of the past. But the growth of technical dexterity was a poor compensation for the narrowing of interests. The individual was sacrificed to make the artist, and art too suffered by the divorce from practical affairs. If we are moved to impatience by the waste of life and energy involved in the turmoils of medieval Italy, we must remember that in no atmosphere less electric would the national energies have matured so early or piled achievement on achievement with such feverish speed. Illustration. Map. The Alps and North Italy. The city, from time immemorial, the meeting ground for the best elements in Italian society, had become in the early Middle Ages the one bulwark between the Italian middle classes and a particularly lawless form of feudalism, and it had served this purpose well. The number of these cities, their population and resources, the luxury of the citizens, the splendor of the palaces and public buildings, were the admiration of all Europe at a time when the Flemish burghers still lived in wooden houses and the Flemish cities were still rudely protected by palisades and earthen ramparts. Nature had done much for Italy. Thanks to the central situation of the peninsula, the trade between northern Europe and the Mediterranean converged upon her seaports and the Alpine passes, which stand above the valley of the Po. The untiring industry of Italian capital and labour made Lombardy and Tuscany the homes of textile manufactures, of scientific cultivation, of banking and finance. In every port of the Levant, the Aegean and the Black Sea, the shipmen and merchants of Venice, Genoa and Pisa hunted for trade like sleuth-hounds and fought like wolves to secure a preference or a monopoly. By land and sea, the rule of life was competition for territory and trade. War was a normal and often a welcome incident in the quest for wealth. Few Italians were free from the belief that conquests are a shortcut to prosperity, that trade follows the flag, and that the gain of one community must be another's loss. Within the city walls, class strove with class and family with family. Riot, massacre, and proscription were the normal instruments of party warfare. Minorities conspired from fear of proscription, and majorities prescribed in order to forestall conspiracy. Boundless, indeed, was the vitality of republics, which, under such conditions, not only throve, but also held at bay the ablest sovereigns and the most formidable troops of Europe. The best and the worst features of the communal regime are illustrated in the resistance of the Lombard cities to Frederick Barbarossa, the first emperor who formulated and applied to Italy a scheme of absolutist government. Between 1154 and 1176, the Lombards turned the course of history. They prepared the way for Innocent III to plant his foot upon the necks of kings, and for Innocent IV to destroy the House of Hohenstaufen. That this would be the result of their stand for liberty, neither they nor the other parties to the struggle could foretell. But on both sides it was felt that the greatest issues were at stake. The question was whether Italy should, once for all, accept a German yoke, whether the papacy should become a German patriarchate, whether free institutions, both in church and state, should give place to a bureaucracy. The question did not take this shape from the beginning. When Frederick first intervened in Lombardy, he came to protect the smaller cities against the imperialist ambitions of Milan, to restore the public peace, to investigate innumerable complaints of force and fraud. Many of the cities hailed him as a deliverer. Against him were only the clients of Milan, or those who, on a humbler scale, aspired to emulate her policy. Even so, it was no easy matter to chastise the most insignificant of the contumacious communes, and Milan, who refused point-blank to give satisfaction for her lawless acts of conquests, or even to renounce what she had won, could not safely be attacked. Two circumstances were against the emperor. Any war against the Lombards must be a war of sieges, but the military science of the age was more skillful in defense than in attack. And no war could be carried to a prosperous conclusion without Italian help, for it was impossible to interest the German princes in the wars of Italy, or to exact substantial help from them. The first of these difficulties Frederick Barbarossa never overcame. With the second, he was more successful in the middle period of the conflict, 1158–1162. And it was then that the representatives of Lombard independence were most nearly overwhelmed. In 1158, he came back from Germany to besiege Milan, having carefully concluded treaties with her rivals in Lombardy, in Bay, the Mark of Verona, in Emilia and the Marches. With their help, he starved the impregnable city into a surrender on terms dictated by himself. In these, there was nothing to excite suspicion or alarm. It was a matter of course that the Milanese should take the oath of allegiance and emancipate the enslaved cities. He stipulated further for a palace in the city and for the restitution of all imperial prerogatives, regalia, which the consuls had usurped, but the full import of these latter articles only became clear some 2 months later, when he announced his future policy at a diet held on the plain of Roncaglia. He disclaimed the intention of ruling as a tyrant, but demanded that his lawful rights should be respected. As guardian of the public peace, he would permit no private wars to be waged, and no leagues to be formed among the cities. As lord of the land, he claimed, under the title of regalia, a formidable list of rights and dues which the jurists of Bologna had compiled at the expense of much historical research. It included the nomination of the highest magistrate in every city, the supreme jurisdiction in appeals and criminal causes, the control of mints, markets, and highways, and rights of purveyance and taxation. Some of these had been in abeyance from time immemorial. Most of them had been exercised by the cities for more than 50 years. Frederick held that no prescription could avail against the crown, and, if this attitude seemed more appropriate to a Justinian than to a king of the Lombards, there was still something to be said for his claims on grounds of public policy. Till a strong monarchy was re-established in Italy, city would oppress city, and the strong would rob the weak. But such a monarchy could only be maintained if an ample revenue were assured, and if the powers arrogated by the communes were curtailed. Even those cities which had originally supported Frederick began to waver when they saw the logical consequences of his policy. They were not disposed to cavil at any measures that he might take against Milan, but to deal with friend and foe on the same principles struck them as injustice. To run the risk of enslavement by a neighbour was an evil, but it was worse to lose forever the prospect of enslaving others. And what guarantee was there that the new absolutism, once firmly in the saddle, would always be benevolent, or would always be represented by officials of integrity? The claims of the emperor might be in a sense historical, but the cities knew, if he did not, that the so-called restoration of regalia was in effect a revolution. The time was nearly ripe for general defection. Loyalty was strained to breaking point when Frederick began to appoint for each city a resident commissioner, podesta, empowered to exercise the regalian rights and to collect the revenue accruing from them. But Milan was still feared and hated. When she alleged that her recent treaty of capitulation was infringed by the decrees of Roncaglia, and when she expelled the envoys whom Frederick had sent to install a podesta, the other cities rallied to the imperial cause. There was one notable exception. The little commune of Crema had been ordered to destroy her walls. She refused and made common cause with her great neighbour. The imperial ban was issued against both cities, April 1159. Troops were hurriedly called up from Germany, and contingents were obtained from the Italian allies, until Frederick had in the field a force estimated at 100,000 men. But for 6 months he was held in check by the resistance of Crema, which he had planned to reduce with a small force while the main bulk of his levies were gathering for the siege of Milan. The attack on Crema was cordially seconded by the citizens of the neighbouring Cremona, who gave their assistance in diverting the watercourses which ran through the city, and lent Frederick the most famous of living engineers to make his siege machines. Crema was completely invested, and every known method of assault was tried. The moat was filled with fascines, and movable towers of wood, so high as to overtop the battlements, were brought up to the walls, which were also attacked with rams, and undermined by sappers working in the shelter of huge penthouses. But breaches were no sooner made than repaired. Every scaling party was repulsed, and the defenders derided the emperor in opprobrious songs. For once in his life, he descended to bluster and ferocious inhumanity. He swore that he would give no quarter. He executed captives within sight of the walls, and he suspended his hostages in baskets from the most exposed parts of the siege towers. Fortunately for his fame, he relented when hunger and the desertion of their master engineer compelled the Cremasy to sue for terms. They received permission to depart with as much property as they could carry on their backs. The rest fell to the imperial army, and the men of Cremona were commissioned to demolish the city, which they did with a good will. The turn of Milan followed. The emperor, warned by experience, fell back upon the slow and costly but irresistible method of blockade. At the end of 8 months, May 1161, February 1162, the city was surrendered, evacuated, and condemned to destruction, a sentence which it was found impossible to execute completely. So solid were the ramparts, and so vast the buildings they enclosed. For the moment, all resistance seemed at an end. The policy outlined at Roncaglia could at length be put in force through the length and breadth of Lombardy, and Frederick departed for Germany, leaving trustworthy lieutenants to complete the vindication of his Italian rights. It only remained to try conclusions with a recalcitrant pope and the evasive Normans of the south. The emperor already saw himself, in imagination the master of Italy and even of the West, nearer to his goal. Then Frederick returned to effect the expulsion of Alexander III from Rome. He succeeded in this object and was crowned in St. Peter's by the anti-pope of his own choosing, August 1167. It was the highest point of his fortunes, and the calamities which followed were so unforeseen and terrible that contemporaries saw in them the hand of God. While he was still in Rome, a pestilence broke out which cost him 2,000 knights and his best counsellors. He was forced to fly from the infected city. On his way to the north, he found the road barred by a new and formidable coalition. The Lombard League had come into existence, an alliance organized by Cremona, hitherto the staunchest of imperial allies, and closely linked with Venice, which Frederick had regarded as a negligible quantity. Of the intentions of the League there could be no doubt. The members were already engaged in the rebuilding of Milan. They had admitted to their inmost councils a legate of Alexander III. They announced that they would only render to the emperor his ancient and undoubted rights. Frederick would not trust himself in their vicinity. Accompanied by a handful of knights, he escaped ignominiously to the north, taking a circuitous route through Savoy. The Leaguers no longer troubled to mask their true intentions. As a token of their unity, they built the city of Alessandria, named after Frederick's bitterest enemy, the lawful pope, and they solemnly repudiated the appellate jurisdiction of the imperial law court, 1168. 6 years elapsed before Frederick could return to demand satisfaction, and even then he could only muster some 8,000 men. From October 1174 to April 1175, he was engaged, first in besieging Alessandria, and then in making fruitless overtures to the League for a compromise. By the end of 1175, he was virtually blockaded in Pavia with a dwindling remnant of his army. Reinforced in the spring, he made a rapid march on Milan in the hope of taking unawares the headquarters of the League. But the Lombards were forewarned and met him at Legnano, 29th of May 1176, with a force outnumbering his by more than 2 to 1. The battle was hotly contested. The Lombard vanguard, composed of cavalry, scattered before the onslaught of the Germans. The emperor then led a charge which penetrated to the centre of the enemy's position. Here was the banner of Milan mounted on a triumphal car, carroccio, and guarded by picked burgesses who had sworn to defend their trust to the death. Round them, the fighting raged for hours. The Germans made no impression on their ranks, and by degrees the Lombard troops who had fled returned to renew the battle. At length, the imperial standard-bearer was slain, and Frederick himself unhorsed. Thinking all was lost, the imperialists fled confusedly towards Pavia, which they reached after suffering more loss in the flight than in the battle. Frederick, cut off from his followers, only escaped capture by hiding for some days until the road to Pavia was clear. Legnano was no overwhelming catastrophe, but it was ominous that citizen levies had defeated German knights in a fair field. Frederick's councillors insisted that it was foolhardiness to pursue the war interminably, when at any moment the papal interest might gain the upper hand in Germany. Peace must be made at any cost with Alexander, and he would accept no peace from which the Lombards were excluded. Frederick yielded to the inevitable with a good grace. A treaty was concluded with the Pope in the same year, November 1176. A few months later, a 6 years' truce with the Lombards was arranged at Venice, and at Constance in 1183, this was converted into a lasting peace. In form, there was a compromise. The cities, while retaining the regalia and the free election of their consuls, recognized their allegiance to the emperor and his appellate jurisdiction. In reality, the emperor had surrendered everything of value, and the cities ignored any stipulations in the treaty which were unfavorable to them. So matters remained until Frederick II, the grandson of Barbarossa, having firmly established himself in his Sicilian heritage, began to meditate a closer union between his dominions north and south of the Alps. The better to secure his communications with Germany, he prepared to enforce in Lombardy the imperial rights reserved at Constance, 1226. At once, the dormant Lombard League revived. The Alpine passes were so effectually blockaded that Frederick was left entirely dependent on his Sicilian forces. He turned the flank of the League at length by an alliance with Ezelin da Romano, the tyrant of Verona, which gave him access to the Brenner Pass. But the League retaliated by lending support to his rebellious son, Henry, King of the Germans. So began another war in Lombardy. Legnano was brilliantly avenged on the field of Cortenuova, 1237, where the emperor routed the Milanese and captured the Carroccio, the symbol of their independence. But he, like his grandfather, was worn out by the difficulties of siege warfare, and in 1240 he turned southward to reduce the states of the church. One more attempt he made on Lombardy in the winter of 1247-1248. But a disastrous fiasco destroyed his hopes and gave a mortal blow to his prestige. For 5 months he blockaded Parma, and the city was at the last gasp when he imprudently dismissed a part of his troops. The garrison saw their opportunity and made a desperate sortie while the emperor was absent on a hunting expedition. They surprised and burned the strongly fortified camp, which he had named Victoria. His baggage and even his crown jewels were captured. More than half of his army were slain or taken, and the rest fled in confusion to Cremona, 118th February 1248. It was necessary for Frederick to beat a retreat, and he appeared no more in Lombardy. His son Enzio, whom he left to represent him, was captured next year by the Bolognese and sentenced to perpetual captivity. Frederick died in 1250, and from this year we may date both the disruption of the empire and the decadence of the free Italian commune. What he had failed to effect, with the united power of Sicily and Germany behind him, was accomplished by a score of petty local dynasties. At Milan, the Visconti completed the enslavement which the Delia Torre had first planned. At Verona, it was the Scaligeri who entered on the imperial inheritance. At Ferrara, the Este. At Padua, the Carrara. At Mantua, the Gonzaga. The tide of despotism rose slowly but surely, until in the 15th century, Venice alone remained to remind Italy of the possibility of freedom. It is to Germany, rather than Italy or Flanders, that we must look for the last, and perhaps the most, fruitful phase in the development of medieval town life. Free institutions were acquired by the German towns comparatively late, and although it was the Lombard commune which they aspired to reproduce, they never succeeded in securing so large a measure of independent power, or in making themselves the capitals of petty states. The Hohenstaufen, like the early Capets, were sensible of the advantages to be gained by alliance with the Third Estate. But Frederick II was obliged to renounce the right of creating free imperial cities within the fiefs of the great princes, and most towns were left to bargain single-handed with their immediate lords. Shut off from any prospects of territorial sovereignty, the towns, even those which held from the empire, were also excluded from the Diet until the close of the 15th century. Trade afforded the only outlet for their activities, but in trade, they engaged with such success that, by the close of the Middle Ages, Augsburg rivaled Florence as a centre of cosmopolitan finance, and the Baltic towns had developed a commerce comparable to that of the Mediterranean. It was the Baltic trade which gave birth to a new form of municipal league, the famous Hansa. The nucleus of this association was an alliance formed between Lübeck and Hamburg, to protect the traffic of the Elbe. Other cities were induced to affiliate themselves, and in 1299, the Hansa absorbed the older Gothland League, of which Wisby was the centre. By the year 1400, there were upwards of 80 Hanseatic cities, lying chiefly in the Lower Rhineland, in Saxony, in Brandenburg, and along the Baltic coast. But the commercial sphere of the League extended from England to Russia and from Norway to Krakow. The Hanseatic cities were subject to many different suzerains and were federated only for the protection of their trade. The League was loosely knit together. There was a representative congress which met at irregular intervals in Lübeck. But the delegates had no power to bind their cities. There was only a small federal revenue, no standing fleet or army, and no means of coercing disobedient members save by exclusion from trade privileges. Yet this amorphous union ranked for some purposes as an independent power. The Hansa policed the Baltic and the waterways and high roads of North Germany. It owned factories, steelyards, in London, Bruges, Bergen, and Novgorod. It concluded commercial treaties, and on occasion, it waged wars. In the 14th century, it monopolized the Baltic trade and was courted by all the nations which had interests in that sea. In the 15th, it began to decline, and in the age of the Reformation sank into insignificance. New sea powers arose. England and the Netherlands, Sweden and Denmark came into competition with the Hanso. The growth of territorialism in Germany sapped the independence of the leading members of the League, and the Baltic trade, like that of the Mediterranean, became of secondary importance when the Portuguese had discovered the Cape route to India, and when the work of Columbus, Cortes, and Pizarro opened up a new world in the Western Hemisphere.